Hey guys, tonight we're stepping onto the rain-slicked docks of 1870s Buffalo, where the air reeks of fish, coal smoke, and the particular desperation of men willing to risk their lives on fresh water that kills as efficiently as any ocean. You can hear the creak of wooden hulls grinding against piers, the shouts of stevedores, and the sharp crack of canvas sails being raised on schooners preparing to venture out onto Lake Erie. This isn't some romantic nautical adventure. This is industrial-age manual labour on vessels that might very well sink before winter comes, taking you down into water so cold your body will preserve itself for decades. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the Buffalo waterfront in late April, watching ice floes still drifting past the harbour entrance, while shipping agents work the crowd of job seekers with practiced enthusiasm. Spring has finally arrived, which means the Great Lakes shipping season is about to explode into activity after months of frozen silence. The agent currently trying to catch your eye is wearing a surprisingly nice coat, always a warning sign, and he's describing a prime berth on a finest vessel that needs crew immediately. The pay sounds almost reasonable, $25 a month, which is better than the factory work you've been doing all winter. What he doesn't mention is that immediately means the ship is so desperate for bodies that the previous crew probably abandoned it, that finest vessel means it hasn't sunk yet, and that $25 will shrink considerably once the captain starts deducting for your bunk, your meals, and any equipment you need to borrow. But you're broke, the rent's due, and working on the lakes beats another season in the grain elevator. So you nod, and just like that, you're a Great Lakes sailor. The shipping agent leads you down the dock toward a three-masted schooner that looks simultaneously impressive and concerning. Her name is painted across the stern, the Northern Star or the Lake Wind or some other optimistic lie, and she's maybe 150 feet long, her wooden hull painted in a black and white scheme that's supposed to make her visible in fog. She's not alone. Dozens of similar vessels crowd Buffalo's harbour, creating a forest of masts that rocks gently with the wind. These schooners are the freight trains of the Great Lakes, hauling lumber, grain, iron ore and coal between ports scattered across 5 connected seas that together form the largest freshwater system on Earth. You're joining about 8 other new recruits, and the diversity is honestly impressive in its own chaotic way. There's a Norwegian who barely speaks English but apparently has sailing experience from the old country. A kid who looks maybe 15 and is definitely lying about his age. A former farmer whose hands are still stained with soil. A grizzled veteran with a scar across his cheek who's probably running from something. 2 Irish brothers who seem to communicate entirely in grunts. And a suspiciously well-dressed man who you suspect might be a drunk lawyer or possibly a journalist slumming it for a story. The shipping agent introduces you to the first mate, a stocky man with forearms like oak branches and a permanent squint from decades of staring into the sun's reflection off the water. He looks you over with the enthusiasm of someone inspecting particularly disappointing livestock. "You ever sailed before?" he asks. You mention that you've been in rowboats, which causes him to emit a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Sure, that'll help when we're running before a nor'wester with 8-foot seas. Welcome aboard." Historians still argue whether the Great Lakes shipping industry of the 1870s was more dangerous than ocean sailing, but the statistics aren't comforting either way. Hundreds of vessels disappeared every decade, taking their crews with them into water that rarely surrendered bodies. The lakes have their own personality. They're shallow enough to create steep, choppy waves that can overwhelm a vessel faster than ocean swells, and they're surrounded by enough land to generate unpredictable weather systems that appear with almost no warning. The first mate directs you to stow your bag, which should contain little more than a change of clothes, a knife, and maybe a Bible if you're the praying type, in the forecastle. As you head toward the bow, you pass the cargo hold, where stevedores are still loading what appears to be lumber. The smell of fresh-cut pine is almost pleasant, at least compared to the alternative cargo you might have been hauling. Some vessels carry grain that ferments in the heat, creating explosive gas pockets. Others transport iron ore that shifts in storms, capsizing ships in seconds. Still others haul coal that produces dust thick enough to choke on. Lumber might crush you if it breaks loose, but at least it doesn't explode. The shipping agent who recruited you has already moved on to his next his next valuable crew member, and you realize with sudden clarity that you've just committed yourself to months of work you don't fully understand on a vessel whose seaworthiness you can't evaluate, supervised by men you've never met. The contract you didn't quite read probably includes clauses that favor the ship's owners in every possible dispute. And that attractive monthly wage? You'll be lucky to see half of it after expenses. One of the Irish brothers nudges you and grins. First time on the lakes? You admit that it is. Don't worry, he says with what you choose to interpret as reassuring confidence rather than dark sarcasm. Either you'll love it and sail forever, or you'll hate it and never set foot on a boat again, or you'll drown and won't have to make the decision. He claps you on the shoulder and heads below deck, leaving you wondering if it's too late to run back to the grain elevator. It's not, technically. But you're here now, your bag is stowed, and the first mate is already shouting orders you don't quite understand. Welcome to the Brotherhood of Great Lakes Sailors, a fraternity whose initiation never really ends, and whose membership benefits include exhaustion, danger, and the slim possibility of adventure. The docks behind you are already fading into memory as the crew begins preparations for departure. Ready or not, your life on the water is about to begin. Now that you're actually aboard the Northern Star, walking her deck with the nervous energy of someone who's just made a questionable life choice, the vessel reveals herself to be considerably less impressive than she looked from the dock. From a distance, she seemed substantial. 3 proud masts a respectable length, the confident posture of a ship that knows her business. Up close, though, you're noticing details that the shipping agent somehow forgot to mention. That fresh black paint on the hull, it's covering wood that's been patched so many times you can see the outline of repairs like scars. The deck planking has gaps wide enough to drop a coin through, and when you put your hand on the rail, it flexes in a way that solid oak really shouldn't. The schooner measures about 150 feet from bow to stern and maybe 30 feet across at her widest point, which sounds spacious until you realize that most of that space is dedicated to cargo hold, with the actual living and working areas compressed into whatever's left over. She's a wooden vessel through and through, oak framing, pine planking, and an elaborate system of ribs and beams that's supposed to keep the whole thing from simply folding in half when the waves get serious. The mainstream historical fact that nobody finds comforting. Great Lakes schooners of this era were built light and fast to maximize cargo capacity, which meant they sacrificed structural strength for profit margin. Economy over survival as usual. You're standing roughly amidships. That's the middle of the vessel for those of us who didn't grow up with sailor vocabulary, and from here, you can see the entire layout at once. Forward, toward the pointy end, is the forecastle where you'll be sleeping. That raised cabin amidships houses the galley and the captain's quarters. Aft at the stern is the wheel and the navigation equipment. The rest is just deck and the yawning cargo hold beneath it, currently being filled with pine logs that stick up above the deck level because apparently someone miscalculated how much lumber would actually fit. The 3 masts rise above you, like trees that have been stripped and repurposed, which is exactly what they are. The mainmast amidship stands maybe 90 feet tall, and it's supporting a complicated web of rigging that you're expected to understand eventually. Lines, in proper sailing terminology, run everywhere in a pattern that seems deliberately designed to trip the uninitiated. Some lines control the sails, others adjust the yards, and several appear to serve no purpose except giving the first mate something to yell at you about when you grab the wrong one. The deck itself is about 6 feet above the waterline when the ship is empty, but with cargo loaded you're noticing that the vessel is sitting considerably lower. Water slaps against the hull maybe 3 feet below where you're standing, and you can hear it gurgling through the gaps in the planking. The Norwegian sailor notices your concerned expression and offers what might be reassurance. She takes on maybe 50 gallons an hour when she's working. The pumps keep up, usually. That usually carries a lot of weight. Historians still argue whether Great Lakes schooners were overworked to the point of routine danger, or whether casualties simply reflected the inherent risks of maritime commerce. But either way, you're standing on a vessel that's probably 20 years old, has sailed tens of thousands of miles, and is held together by a combination of carpentry, prayer, and the fact that nobody's found all her weak spots yet. The wood beneath your feet has expanded and contracted through hundreds of freeze-thaw cycles. It's been baked by summer sun and saturated by autumn storms. It's been twisted by waves and strained by cargo, and it's expected to do it all again for maybe another decade before someone declares it unseaworthy. The quirky detail that won't help you sleep tonight. Schooners like this one often developed their own characteristic sounds, specific creaks and groans that experienced sailors learned to interpret like a language. A vessel might sing in a particular way when she was happy and sailing well, or emit a different pattern of complaints when something was wrong. Your job, over the coming months, will be to learn your ship's voice well enough to distinguish normal misery from impending disaster. Fun times ahead. Walking toward the stern, you pass the cargo hold's main hatch, which is currently open to receive the last of the lumber. You peer down into the darkness and see the wooden lattice of the hull's ribs, the ballast stones at the very bottom, and row after row of stacked pine logs. The hold smells like fresh sawdust and bilge water, a combination that's somehow both pleasant and nauseating. When the hatch is closed and sealed, hopefully with enough security to keep water out during storms, you'll be sailing with approximately 200 tons of lumber that will shift, settle, and occasionally try to break free if the seas get rough. The first mate is suddenly beside you, apparently having decided that your self-guided tour needs supervision. She's not much to look at, he admits, which is the nautical equivalent of a glowing endorsement. But she's survived 15 seasons, and that's more than can be said for prettier vessels. He points to a spot near the port rail where the wood is noticeably newer. That's where we took a wave in 72 that stove in 3 planks. We patched her with lumber from our own cargo and made it to Cleveland on the pumps. You're trying to decide if that story is meant to be encouraging or terrifying when he continues, "The thing about these schooners is they're honest. They creak when they're stressed, they leak when they're tired, and they'll tell you straight if they're about to give up. It's the quiet ones you have to worry about, the vessels that fail without warning." He slaps the mainmast affectionately, producing a sound that's less solid than you'd hoped for. The Northern Star complains constantly, which means she's still fighting. You'll learn to appreciate that. The captain emerges from his cabin, a man in his 50s with a beard that's going grey and eyes that have seen too many November storms. He surveys his vessel with the expression of someone who knows every flaw intimately but loves her anyway. "Cast off in 20 minutes, he announces to no one in particular. "Let's see if we can make Cleveland before the weather turns." You look at the sky, which is currently clear and blue, and wonder what turns means in this context. The Norwegian catches your expression and grins. On the lakes, weather doesn't turn. It attacks. You'll see. 20 minutes suddenly seems like barely enough time to reconsider every decision that brought you to this moment. As the crew prepares to cast off, you're starting to notice that everyone aboard has a very clear understanding of where they stand in the pecking order. Everyone except you, that is. The social structure of a Great Lakes schooner is less like a modern workplace with its HR departments and org charts, and more like a feudal kingdom compressed into 150 feet of wooden deck. At the top sits the captain, whose authority is so absolute that he can fire you, dock your pay, or simply leave you stranded in whatever port annoys him least. Below him is the first mate, then the second mate if the vessel is large enough to warrant one, then the able-bodied seamen who actually know what they're doing, then ordinary seamen like yourself who are still figuring out which rope is which, and finally the cabin boy if there is one. Usually some unfortunate teenager whose job description includes everything nobody else wants to do. The captain, as you're quickly learning, doesn't actually do much of the physical sailing. His job is navigation, decision-making, and maintaining an air of stern competence that convinces everyone he knows where you're going. He stands at the wheel or paces the quarterdeck, that raised area at the stern, observing everything with the kind of attention that makes you nervous even when you're doing nothing wrong. On these smaller schooners, the captain often owns a stake in the vessel or the cargo, which means he has personal financial incentive to push through dangerous weather and questionable conditions. Your safety and his profit share the same uncomfortable balance sheet. The first mate is the one who actually runs the ship on a minute-to-minute basis. He's the one shouting orders, organising work details, and making sure the vessel doesn't fall apart through sheer neglect. On the Northern Star, First Mate Johansson has clearly been doing this job long enough to develop that particular combination of efficiency and irritability that comes from managing sailors who don't want to be managed. He knows every inch of this vessel, every weakness in her rigging, and every shortcut that will get the job done without quite killing anyone. You're not sure if you like him yet, but you definitely respect the way he can communicate an entire paragraph of disappointment with just a sigh. The able-bodied seamen, there are 3 of them on this vessel, are the aristocracy of the working crew. They're the ones who can hand, reef and steer, which is sailor speak for actually know how to do all the jobs that keep everyone alive. They get the best sleeping spots in the forecastle, first access to hot food, and the privilege of looking down on ordinary seamen with the contempt of professionals observing amateurs. The quirky historical detail: many able-bodied seamen on Great Lakes vessels were European immigrants who'd learned sailing on ocean-going ships and found the lakes comparatively tame, at least until they experienced their first November gale and realised that freshwater could kill you just as efficiently as salt. Then there's you and the other 4 ordinary seamen, the Irish brothers, the farmer turned sailor, and the kid who's definitely too young for this work but nobody's asking questions. Your position in the hierarchy is warm bodies who can be taught to pull ropes and eventually might become useful. You get the worst sleeping spots, the coldest food, and the most tedious maintenance tasks. Your daily work will include everything from scraping rust to coiling lines to pumping bilge water, with occasional promotions to actually helping with the sails when the able-bodied seamen need extra hands. Historians still argue whether the rigid hierarchy aboard commercial sailing vessels was purely functional, or whether it also served to maintain social control, but from your current position at the bottom, the distinction seems academic. What matters is that the captain's word is law, the first mate's order is immediate, and an able-bodied seaman's suggestion is strongly recommended. You, meanwhile, have approximately 0 authority over anyone except maybe the rats in the forecastle, and even they seem skeptical of your leadership potential. The ship's cook exists in a strange parallel hierarchy all his own. He's not an officer, but he controls the food supply, which gives him power that transcends official rank. On the Northern Star, the cook is a Chinese man named Chen, who apparently arrived in San Francisco years ago, worked his way inland, and now operates the galley with the efficiency of someone who's perfected the art of producing barely edible meals under impossible conditions. He answers to the captain, but mostly ignores everyone else, including the first mate, because what are they going to do? Fire the only person who knows how to work the stove. Your position determines more than just who gets to order you around. It dictates where you sleep. Ordinary seamen get the spots near the leaky forecastle walls, while able-bodied seamen claim the centre bunks. It determines when you eat, officers first, then experienced crew, then you and your fellow newcomers get whatever's left. It affects what you wear. The captain has an actual cabin where he can store spare clothes, while you're working with whatever fits in your single bag. And it establishes how you're addressed. The captain is Captain Morrison, or Sir. The first mate is Mr. Johansson. The able-bodied seamen are called by their surnames, and you're just you there until you prove yourself worthy of a name. The one position lower than ordinary seamen is the cabin boy, and the Northern Star doesn't have one this season, which means ordinary seamen inherit all the cabin boy duties on top of their regular work. These duties include everything from cleaning the captain's quarters, to fetching water, to running messages, to scrubbing the deck, to basically any task that someone needs done but doesn't want to do themselves. You're essentially a combination labourer, janitor and servant, with the added responsibility of learning how to sail so you don't die when the weather gets interesting. What makes this hierarchy especially fun is that it's not just about rank, it's about knowledge. An able-bodied seaman can make you feel spectacularly stupid simply by using correct nautical terminology, while you're still trying to remember that belay means stop, and avast means stop, and vast enough means stop, and apparently sailors really needed multiple ways to say the same thing. The mainmast is in the middle, obviously, but the foremast is in front and the mizzen is in back, except sometimes vessels don't have a mizzen, and the yards are the horizontal beams, but they're not actually called yards in all contexts, and good luck keeping track of which specific line is the halyard versus the sheet versus the brace. First, Mate Johansson seems to take particular pleasure in your confusion. "Haul on that jib sheet," he'll say, watching you look frantically for whatever a jib sheet might be. When you finally grab the correct line, by pure luck more than knowledge, he'll nod with the bare minimum of approval. Good. Now you'll remember it. Pain's a better teacher than patience. You're starting. To understand that climbing this hierarchy will require months or years of accumulated knowledge, physical competence, and the ability to survive long enough to apply both. Welcome to the bottom rung of a very tall, very slippery ladder. The first mate finally sends you below deck to stow your gear properly and get acquainted with your accommodations, which is sailor speak for go see where you'll be suffering for the next 6 months. You duck through a hatch near the bow and immediately crack your head on a beam that's positioned at exactly skull height for anyone over 5.5 feet tall. Welcome to the forecastle, or forecastle if you want to pronounce it like actual sailors do, which is the crew's living quarters and the single least appealing space you've ever been invited to call home. The forecastle is essentially a wooden cave carved into the front of the ship, measuring maybe 15 feet wide and 12 feet deep, with an overhead, that's barely 5 feet high at its tallest point and slopes down to maybe 4 feet near the hull walls. This means you'll be spending your off-duty hours in a permanent crouch or lying down, which sounds restful until you realise you're sharing this space with 8 other men who have varying standards of personal hygiene and conflicting ideas about appropriate sleeping noises. The air down here is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, tar, and something vaguely organic that you're choosing not to investigate too closely. Light filters in through 2 small portholes that are currently open, but will need to be sealed shut the moment the weather turns rough, at which point you'll be living in near total darkness except for the single oil lamp that hangs from a beam and produces more smoke than illumination. The walls, the bulkheads, in proper terminology, are bare wooden planking that weeps moisture constantly, creating a perpetual dampness that ensures nothing you own will ever be truly dry again. Your clothes will develop a particular mildew smell that becomes your signature scent. Your blanket will feel clammy every time you pull it over yourself. Even your skin will take on a sort of perpetual moistness, like you're slowly becoming an amphibian. The sleeping arrangements consist of wooden bunks built into the hull walls, stacked 2 high on each side with maybe 18 inches of space between the top bunk and the overhead. The bunks themselves are just wooden shelves with a thin straw mattress that's seen better decades, a wool blanket that's more holes than fabric, and the optimistic suggestion of a pillow. The Norwegian sailor who offered you earlier advice about the pumps has claimed a lower bunk near the entrance, prime real estate because it gets the most air circulation, while the able-bodied seamen have taken the centre bunks that stay driest in rough weather. You and your fellow newcomers are left with the bunks near the bow, where the hull curves inward and the spaces become increasingly triangular and cramped. You throw your bag onto an upper bunk near the port side, which turns out to be a mistake, because one of the Irish brothers immediately informs you that's where the leak is worst. Sure enough, when you look closely at the overhead, you can see a dark stain where water has been seeping through. You'll want to rig something to catch the drips, he suggests helpfully, or just accept that you'll wake up wet. You move your bag to a different bunk, this one in a corner so tight you'll need to climb in feet first and sleep slightly diagonal. Perfect. The mainstream historical fact that won't comfort you. The average crew quarters on Great Lakes schooners of this era provided about 30 to 40 cubic feet of space per sailor, which is roughly equivalent to living inside a coffin that's slightly too large. Naval architects justified this by noting that sailors spent most of their time on deck anyway, so why waste valuable cargo space on comfort? The fact that sailors also needed to eat, sleep, and recover from exhausting physical labour in these conditions was apparently considered irrelevant. Between the bunks sits a small table barely large enough for 4 men to squeeze around, and this is where you'll eat your meals when the weather's too rough to eat on deck. There's a single bench, which means most people will eat standing up or sitting on their bunks. A few pegs on the wall serve as storage for whatever coats and oilskins the crew owns. A bucket in the corner serves a purpose you'll prefer not to think about, especially during storms when going up on deck for bathroom needs becomes suicidal. And that's it. That's the entire living space for 9 grown men who will spend months in here together. Historians still argue whether the cramped quarters aboard commercial sailing vessels created genuine camaraderie or just forced tolerance among men who would otherwise avoid each other, but you're about to find out firsthand. The Irish brothers are already bickering about something in the corner. The young kid is trying to arrange his bunk with the optimism of someone who hasn't yet realised that organisation is futile. The farmer is sitting on his bunk looking quietly terrified, probably reconsidering every decision that brought him here. And somewhere in the darker recesses of the forecastle, you hear a distinct skittering sound that confirms what the outline promised. You're sharing this space with rats, the quirky detail that nobody warned you about. Great Lakes sailors often developed elaborate systems of courtesy and personal space management in the forecastle, including unwritten rules about how long you could sit on the communal bench, which topics were forbidden during meals, and how to snore quietly enough not to get a boot thrown at your head. Violating these rules could result in anything from mild ostracism to getting your blanket tossed overboard as an accident. You'll be learning these customs through trial and error, with emphasis on the error part. As your eyes adjust to the gloom, you notice that previous occupants have carved their initials into the wooden beams, dozens of names and dates going back. Years, a memorial to everyone who's passed through this floating misery. Some include destinations: Buffalo to Chicago, 1868. Others are more poetic: survived another season, 1871. A few are simply names with no context, and you wonder if those sailors made it off this vessel alive or if their names are the only memorial they'll ever receive. The first mate's voice echoes down from above. "All hands on deck, we're casting off." You take one last look at your new home, noting the low overhead, the damp walls, the inadequate bunks, and the general atmosphere of barely controlled decay. Then you climb back up into the sunshine, suddenly grateful for open air and standing room, knowing that tonight you'll be descending back into that wooden cave to discover what 8 sleeping men sound like in an enclosed space with no ventilation. At least it can't get worse than this, right? Spoiler, it can, and it will. You emerge back on deck just in time to witness Captain Morrison demonstrate why his authority is less organisational chart and more minor deity with a bad temper. One of the able-bodied seamen has apparently coiled a line incorrectly, a crime you can't even identify yet, and the captain is delivering a lecture that combines technical sailing instruction with personal character assessment in ways that would make a drill sergeant blush. That's not a coil, Hansen, that's a tragedy. That's what happens when a man's brain sits idle while his hands pretend to work. Do it again, and this time engage whatever passes for thought in that skull of yours. Hansen, who's probably been sailing longer than you've been alive, simply nods and recoils the line without argument. No backtalk, no explanation, no defence, just immediate compliance. And that, right there, is your introduction to how power actually works on a Great Lakes schooner. The captain's word isn't just final, it's the only word that matters. He can criticise your work, question your intelligence, or mock your appearance, and your job is to say, "Yes, sir," and do better. Welcome to the most absolute monarchy you'll ever experience in democratic America. The mainstream historical fact that legal scholars find fascinating. Within the boundaries of his vessel, a ship's captain in the 1870s held powers that would be unconstitutional on land. He could confine crew members, dock wages without formal hearings, impose physical punishment, though this was falling out of favour, and make life or death decisions with no requirement to justify his choices to anyone until he reached port. Maritime law recognised that the unique dangers and isolation of sea travel required concentrated authority, which is a fancy way of saying somebody has to be in charge or everyone dies. Captain Morrison is in his mid-50s, with the weathered skin of someone who spent 3 decades squinting into sun and spray, and a grey beard that he keeps neatly trimmed despite months at sea. He's not particularly tall or physically imposing, but he carries himself with the assurance of someone who knows his authority doesn't depend on intimidation. It's simply built into the structure of the universe aboard this vessel. When he walks the deck, crew members instinctively move out of his way. When he speaks, conversations stop. When he's in a bad mood, the entire ship feels it like a weather system. And here's the thing about Captain Morrison's moods. They're as unpredictable as the lakes themselves. This morning, during the hiring process, he seemed almost jovial, nodding at the first mate's selections, making small talk about the cargo, generally projecting competence and calm. Now, 2 hours later, he's found 17 things wrong with the ship's preparation and has reduced 2 sailors to quiet humiliation. By this afternoon, he might be cheerful again, or he might maintain this storm of criticism for days. There's no pattern you can learn, no behaviour you can adopt to guarantee his approval. You simply have to accept that his temperament is one more unpredictable force you'll be navigating. First, Mate Johansson catches your expression, probably somewhere between confusion and concern, and pulls you aside while the captain inspects the cargo lashing. The captain's not cruel, he says quietly. He's just carrying every decision that might kill us all, and that weight makes a man volatile. He knows these lakes killed his brother in '69, his former partner in '72s, and at least a dozen men he's sailed with over the years. So when he sees something done wrong, he doesn't see sloppiness. He sees the decision that leads to the accident that leads to the sinking. Understand? You nod, though you're not entirely sure you do understand. Johansson continues. Out here, his authority isn't about ego, it's about survival. When a squall comes up and he orders us to take in sail, we have maybe 10 minutes to execute perfectly. If someone hesitates, if someone questions, if someone decides they know better, we all drown. So we built a system where nobody questions. Ever. He pauses. It's not a perfect system, but it's kept more sailors alive than dead, which is the best we can hope for. Historians still argue whether the absolute authority of ship captains produced better outcomes through decisive leadership, or whether it sometimes led to preventable disasters when captains made errors that subordinates couldn't challenge. But that's a debate for people on solid ground with time to think. Out here, you're learning that the system works because everyone agrees it works, and the moment someone breaks that agreement, the whole structure of shipboard society collapses. The quirky detail that reveals how deep this authority runs. In most Great Lakes ports, if a sailor deserted his ship before completing his contract, the captain could have him arrested and forcibly returned to the vessel. The logic was that a partial crew endangered everyone aboard, so individual liberty took a back seat to collective safety. In practice, this meant that signing onto a schooner was signing away your freedom of movement until the captain decided to release you, which usually meant the end of the shipping season, when keeping you aboard no longer profited anyone. Captain Morrison's authority extends to every aspect of your existence aboard the Northern Star. He decides when you work and when you rest. He determines what you eat, or rather, he determines the budget that dictates what the cook can buy. He controls whether you get shore leave in port or stay aboard to watch the ship. He sets the vessel's schedule, choosing whether to push through dangerous weather or wait for calmer conditions. He even has the final say on medical treatment if you get injured, though his expertise probably doesn't extend much beyond wrap it tight and pour whiskey on it. What makes this power even more interesting is that the captain often has financial skin in the game. Captain Morrison, you'll learn over coming weeks, owns a quarter share in the Northern Star, which means every successful cargo delivery increases his wealth, and every delay cost him money. This aligns his interest with the ship's profitability, but not necessarily with your safety. When he decides to sail through questionable weather, he's balancing the risk of sinking against the risk of missing a delivery window and losing his payment. Your life is on one side of that calculation, his mortgage is on the other. Sleep well with that thought. The captain is now walking toward the bow, inspecting the anchor tackle with the attention of someone looking for problems. You wisely stay out of his path, learning the first rule of survival. When the captain's on the hunt for imperfection, don't provide an easy target. Be busy, look competent, and pray he doesn't notice you exist. The Northern Star casts off from Buffalo with all the ceremony of leaving a parking space. Lines are untied, the tug gives you a pull into the channel, and suddenly you're drifting away from solid ground with no clear idea when you'll see it again. The captain takes the wheel personally for the departure, steering through the harbour traffic with the casual confidence of someone who could do this in his sleep, which you'll eventually learn he basically does. But once you're clear of the harbour and out onto Lake Erie proper, he turns the wheel over to First Mate Johansson and disappears into his cabin, leaving you to discover the grinding reality of shipboard life, the watch system. "All right, listen up," Johansson announces, gathering the crew amidships. "We run 4-hour watches around the clock. That means 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off. Repeat forever until you die or reach port, whichever comes first." He's not entirely joking about the death part. Starboard watch is Hansen, Berg, Murphy, and you three new fellows. He points to you, the farmer, and the young kid. Port watch is the rest. Starboard watch takes the deck now until 8 bells. Port watch, get below and rest while you can. What Johansson hasn't explained, because apparently everyone except you already knows this, is that the watch system is specifically designed to destroy any sense of normal human sleep patterns. You'll work from noon to 4 p.m., sleep from 4 to 8, work from 8 p.m. to midnight, sleep from midnight to 4 a.m., work from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., sleep from 8 a.m. to noon, and then start over. Those aren't full night's sleep. Those are 4-hour naps interrupted by 4-hour work periods, cycling endlessly until your body forgets what well-rested even means. Welcome to maritime exhaustion as a permanent lifestyle. The mainstream historical fact that explains why this terrible system persists. 4-hour watches became standard on sailing vessels because that's roughly how long sailors could maintain peak alertness while performing the constant vigilance required to keep a ship safe. Longer watches led to dangerous fatigue errors. Shorter watches didn't provide enough rest between shifts. So 4 hours became the compromise between human limitations and operational necessity, even though it meant nobody ever slept properly again. Your first watch starts immediately, which means you're on duty now at noon, under a bright spring sun that makes Lake Erie look almost welcoming. Hansen, one of the able-bodied seamen, is technically in charge of your watch, though First Mate Johansen is still on deck supervising everything because he apparently doesn't trust any of you to not immediately sink the ship. Your duties during this watch include monitoring the sails for any signs of trouble, keeping an eye on the horizon for other vessels or weather changes, performing whatever maintenance tasks Johansen assigns, and generally staying awake and alert even though you're not quite sure what you're supposed to be alert for. You, Johansen says, pointing at you, take the bilge pump for 30 minutes, then Murphy will spell you. The bilge pump is exactly what it sounds like, a manual pump that removes the water constantly seeping into the hull through various leaks and gaps. You find it near the mainmast, a cast iron contraption with a long handle that you're expected to work up and down in a steady rhythm. Pump, 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 while water trickles out through a discharge pipe and back into the lake. It's mindless work that requires just enough effort to be tiring, but not enough to be interesting. Perfect for a 4-hour shift. After 30 minutes, your arms are burning and you're relieved by Murphy, one of the Irish brothers, who takes over the pumping with the resigned expression of someone who's done this job 1,000 times. Johansen assigns you to coiling lines next, taking all the ropes that have been left in disarray during the departure, and coiling them into neat circles that won't tangle when they're needed in a hurry. This is where you start learning that there's a right way to coil a line, clockwise with the natural twist of the rope, and a wrong way, literally any other method, and that doing it wrong will earn you the kind of correction that makes you wish you'd paid better attention. The 4 hours crawl past like syrup in winter. You pump bilge water, coil lines, scrape rust off metal fittings, help adjust a sail that's flapping wrong, fetch water for the crew, and stand at the rail doing absolutely nothing except watching the shoreline slowly disappear in the distance. By the time 8 bells ring, that's maritime timekeeping, where each half hour gets a bell strike, so 8 bells means 4 hours, you're exhausted from work that didn't even feel particularly hard. It's more the mental strain of constant alertness, of trying to look useful, of being in an unfamiliar environment where everything you touch might be critical to survival. Port watch on deck, starboard watch below. Johansen's voice carries across the deck and you gratefully head down to the forecastle for your 4 hours of rest. Except it's not really rest because the off-duty watch is sleeping, snoring, talking, playing cards, and generally making sleep impossible for anyone with working eardrums. You lie in your bunk feeling the ship rock beneath you, a motion that's almost pleasant now that you're horizontal, and try to shut out the sounds of 8 men existing in too small a space. You're just drifting off when 8 bells ring again, pulling you back to consciousness for the 8 p.m. to midnight watch. It's dark now, and the deck is a different world. The sails are pale shapes against the stars, the water is invisible black except where it catches moonlight, and the wind has picked up enough to make the rigging hum. This watch is colder, stranger, more isolating. You're assigned to the bow as lookout, watching for other vessels or obstacles in the water, which sounds important until you realise you can't actually see much of anything in the darkness. But you stand there anyway, peering into nothing, because that's what the system requires. Historians still argue whether the sleep deprivation inherent in the watch system significantly increased accident rates, or whether sailors simply adapted to functioning on fragmented sleep, but from your current state of fuzzy-headed exhaustion, you're pretty sure adaptation is a myth invented by people who sleep in actual beds. The quirky detail that makes this system even more fun, the watch schedule rotates slightly each day due to an odd number of watches in a 24-hour period, which means you'll gradually cycle through all the time slots over the course of several days, ensuring that you'll eventually work every unpleasant shift, including the dreaded graveyard watch from midnight to 4 a.m., when human bodies are biologically programmed to be unconscious. Midnight comes eventually, signalled by 8 bells that sound like salvation. You stumble below, collapse into your bunk, and immediately fall asleep despite the noise, the dampness and the smell. 4 hours later, 8 bells wake you for the 4 a.m. watch, and you realise this is your life now. By your 3rd day aboard the Northern Star, you've worked through enough watch rotations to achieve a state of permanent grogginess, and you're starting to understand that the exhaustion is only part of your suffering. The other part is delivered 3 times daily by Chen, the ship's cook, who operates the galley with the efficiency of an alchemist who's perfected the art of transforming ingredients into something technically edible but spiritually crushing. Mealtime aboard a Great Lakes schooner isn't about cuisine or satisfaction. It's about consuming enough calories to keep working, and Chen has mastered the minimum viable standard. The galley itself is a cramped wooden box amidships, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, containing a cast iron stove that's bolted to the deck, a work counter that doubles as food storage, and barely enough room for one person to turn around without burning themselves. Chen rules this kingdom absolutely, and even the captain knows better than to criticize the cook, because a vengeful cook can make life spectacularly unpleasant through subtle adjustments to food quality, portion size, and mysterious accidents involving excessive salt or insufficient cooking time. You haven't seen inside the galley yet. Ordinary seamen aren't allowed in that sacred space, but you've seen the results of Chen's labour, and results is honestly being generous. Breakfast arrives at 8 a.m, delivered to the deck in a large pot that Chen carries with the careful balance of someone who's done this in much rougher seas. Today's offering is oatmeal, or rather, a substance that was once oatmeal before being boiled into submission and mixed with enough water to stretch it across 9 crew members and 3 officers. You receive your portion in a tin bowl, your personal eating utensil that you're responsible for keeping and cleaning, and the grey mass inside looks less like food and more like something scraped from the hull. The taste is vaguely grain-like with undertones of tin and a texture that's simultaneously watery and lumpy. You eat it anyway, because the alternative is being hungry during your next watch, and hunger makes everything worse. The mainstream historical fact that won't improve your appetite. The standard provisions on Great Lakes commercial vessels included salt pork, hardtack biscuits, dried beans, potatoes, occasional fresh bread in port, coffee and whatever else could be purchased cheaply and stored without refrigeration. Fresh vegetables were rare luxuries. Meat beyond salt pork was nearly unheard of. The resulting diet was heavy on carbohydrates and salt, light on vitamins, and virtually guaranteed to give you scurvy if the season ran too long. Sailors in the 1870s were essentially eating a diet designed for survival, not health. Lunch appears at noon during the watch change, and today Chen has created what he calls sea pie, which is a generous name for what's essentially salt pork chunks boiled with potatoes and ship's biscuit in a gravy that tastes like salted regret. The salt pork is the foundation of shipboard cuisine. Preserved pork that's been packed in barrels of brine so salty it could mummify a whale. Before cooking, it's supposed to be soaked in fresh water to remove excess salt, but Chen apparently believes in preserving its authentic ocean flavour, which means every bite makes you desperately thirsty. The potatoes are at least recognisable as potatoes, though they're starting to sprout because this cargo has been in storage since last autumn. The ship's biscuit, hardtack, is a rock-hard cracker that requires soaking in liquid to become chewable, and even then it maintains a texture somewhere between wood and ceramic. You're eating this masterpiece on deck, standing near the rail because the communal table is full, when you notice movement in your biscuit. Upon closer inspection, you discover weevils, tiny beetles that have colonized the ship's biscuit supply and are now part of your protein intake. Murphy, the Irish sailor, notices your hesitation and grins. Extra meat, no charge. Just eat around them if you're squeamish, or eat them if you're practical. They're all the same once they're in your stomach. This is apparently the sailor's approach to food safety. If it doesn't immediately kill you, it's fine. Historians still argue whether the notoriously poor quality of shipboard food was due to genuine economic constraints, or whether ship owners simply didn't care about crew welfare. But the truth probably involves both. Feeding sailors well would cut into profit margins, and since sailors were replaceable, there was little incentive to improve conditions. Your suffering is literally built into the business model. Dinner is served at 6 p.m, and it's the most elaborate meal of the day, which tells you something about the competition. Tonight Chen has prepared salt pork again, shocking twist, but this time it's fried and served with boiled potatoes and what might technically be gravy if you're willing to stretch the definition. There's also bread, Actual fresh bread that Chen baked this morning, and it's the highlight of your entire day. It's slightly burnt on the bottom and undercooked in the middle, but it's not salt pork or hardtack, so you savour every bite like it's fine dining. The quirky detail that explains why sailors don't mutiny over the food. Chen is actually considered a decent cook by Great Lakes standards. Some vessels serve nothing but salt pork, hardtack and coffee for weeks on end. Some cooks can't bake bread at all. Some galleys are so poorly equipped that meals consist of whatever can be boiled in a single pot. The Northern Star's galley has an actual oven. Chen knows how to use it, and he occasionally produces meals that contain more than 2 ingredients. You're living in comparative luxury, which is a depressing thought. Coffee is available constantly, and it's the one provision that never runs short. Chen keeps a pot on the stove all day, producing a black liquid that's strong enough to strip paint and bitter enough to make you reconsider your life choices. But it's hot, it contains caffeine, and it gives you something to look forward to during the cold watches. You drink it from tin cups that retain heat poorly, burning your lips on the first sip and letting the rest go lukewarm before you finish. Over the weeks ahead, you'll develop a genuine addiction to this awful coffee, craving it during your off-watch sleep periods and dreaming about its bitter warmth. The eating hierarchy you learned about earlier extends to meals. Officers eat first, in the captain's cabin, where they presumably receive better portions and maybe even butter for their bread. Able-bodied seamen eat next, claiming the best spots at the communal table. Ordinary seamen eat last, taking whatever's left and eating wherever they can find space. By the time you get your portion, the food is cold, the best pieces are gone, and you're eating standing up while trying not to spill on the deck. Chen himself remains a mystery. He speaks minimal English, responds to complaints with shrugs, and somehow produces meals in conditions that would break most cooks. The galley stove requires constant attention to maintain proper temperature. The ship's motion means everything's sliding around constantly. Supplies are limited, repetitive, and often spoiling. Yet 3 times a day, Chen delivers food that meets the absolute minimum standard of edibility, and for that alone, he deserves more respect than he receives. You finish your dinner, such as it was, and rinse your bowl in a bucket of lake water, already resigned to tomorrow's menu. Salt pork, potatoes, and disappointment. 2 days out from Buffalo, you arrive at Cleveland just as dawn breaks over the warehouses lining the Cuyahoga River, and you discover that sailing the ship is actually the easy part of your job. The hard part, the part that will leave you so exhausted you can barely climb into your bunk, is loading and unloading cargo, which transforms you from a sailor into a longshoreman who happens to work on water. The Northern Star has delivered her lumber successfully, and now she's taking on a new cargo of iron ore bound for Buffalo, which means you're about to spend the next 12 hours hauling heavy things in conditions that would violate every workplace safety regulation that won't be invented for another 50 years. The vessel ties up at a loading dock where a massive wooden chute extends out over the water, positioned directly above the open cargo hold. This chute connects to a warehouse where the iron ore is stored, and the loading process is brutally simple. Ore gets dumped down the chute, falls into the hold, and you get to stand in that hold shoveling it into the corners so more can fit. It's mining work combined with sailing work, and it's every bit as unpleasant as that combination sounds. You and the other ordinary seamen are sent down into the hold with shovels while the able-bodied seamen get to stay on deck, guiding the ore flow and occasionally pretending to supervise. The first load comes roaring down the chute like a metallic avalanche, crashing into the hold with a sound that echoes through the wooden hull. Red-brown chunks of ore pile up in a growing mound, and you start shoveling, pushing the heavy rocks toward the corners and edges to distribute the weight evenly. Iron ore is dense, far denser than lumber, and each shovelful weighs enough to make your shoulders burn. Within 20 minutes you're sweating despite the cool morning air. Within an hour your hands are blistering even through the leather gloves you borrowed from the ship's supplies. Within 2 hours you're operating on pure stubbornness, because your body has already voted to quit, but your need for wages overrules it. The mainstream historical fact that explains why you're doing this instead of using machinery. In the 1870s, mechanical loading equipment existed but was expensive to install and maintain, so most smaller ports relied on manual labour supplemented by simple chutes and gravity. Large ports like Chicago and Detroit had steam-powered cranes and conveyors, but Cleveland's smaller docks still operated on the assumption that human backs were cheaper than mechanical systems. Your suffering is an economic decision made by people who will never shovel a single rock themselves. The hold is filling from the bottom up, and as the level rises, you're working in an increasingly confined space, surrounded by tons of loose ore that shifts slightly with each shovelful. The dust is incredible, a fine red powder that fills the air, coats your skin, and invades your lungs with every breath. You tie a bandana over your nose and mouth, which helps approximately not at all. By the third hour, you're coughing constantly, and the snot you blow out of your nose is rust-coloured. The young kid who lied about his age is working next to you, and he's already flagging, moving slower with each load. Nobody offers to let him rest because there's no one to replace him, and the ore keeps coming. The ship is listing now, leaning to one side, because the ore is being loaded faster on the port side than you can distribute it. First Mate Johansson is on deck shouting adjustments, trying to balance the load, but with thousands of pounds of ore already in the hold and more arriving constantly, perfect balance is impossible. The vessel tilts maybe 10 degrees, which doesn't sound like much until you're standing on a slanted deck trying to shovel heavy rocks uphill. Everything's rolling toward the low side, including loose ore that keeps sliding down and needing to be reshoveled. It's Sisyphean labour with industrial age efficiency. Historians still argue whether the dangers of manual cargo loading led to significantly more deaths than other aspects of maritime work, or whether the risks simply added to the general hazard level that sailors already accepted. But from your current position under tons of unstable ore in a tilted hold, the academic debate seems less important than the immediate question of whether this entire pile might shift suddenly and bury you alive. Around noon, Chen appears at the edge of the hold with food, more salt pork and bread, eaten standing up while covered in ore dust. You take 10 minutes to eat, then it's back to shoveling because the loading dock charges by the hour and Captain Morrison wants to minimise port fees. The afternoon stretches into evening, and you've moved beyond pain into a numb state where your body is operating on autopilot. Shovel, throw, pause to cough up red dust, shovel, throw. The pile in the hold is nearly level with the deck now. Tons and tons of ore compressed into a space that suddenly seems far too small to contain that much weight. The quirky detail that reveals how dangerous this work is. Great Lakes vessels frequently capsized at the dock during loading, when ore was distributed unevenly, causing catastrophic tilting that couldn't be corrected quickly enough. Entire crews occasionally died without ever leaving port, crushed under shifting cargo, or drowned when their vessel rolled over while still tied to the pier. The fact that you're currently standing under several £1,000s of loose ore in a ship that's visibly tilting should probably concern you more than it does, but exhaustion has dulled your survival instincts. Finally, as the sun sets over Cleveland, the last load comes down the chute. First, Mate Johansson inspects the hold, declares it good enough, and orders the hatches battened down. You climb out of that red-brown pit looking like you've been mining on Mars, every inch of your skin and clothing coated in iron dust. Your hands are bleeding through the gloves. Your back feels like someone inserted steel rods where your spine used to be. Your lungs are making sounds they shouldn't make. And tomorrow morning, you'll cast off and start the return voyage to Buffalo, where you'll get to unload all this ore using the same back-breaking process in reverse. Welcome to the glamorous life of Great Lakes shipping, where sailor is just another word for person who does heavy manual labour in multiple locations. The Northern Star casts off from Cleveland at dawn, now riding substantially lower in the water with several hundred tons of iron ore in her belly, and you're finally getting to witness what Captain Morrison actually does to earn his position beyond criticising rope coils and controlling your destiny. Navigation on the Great Lakes in 1875 is part science, part art, and part stubborn refusal to admit that these inland waters are as deadly as any ocean. The captain stands at the wheel with a confidence that would be reassuring if you didn't know how many experienced captains have steered their vessels directly onto rocks, shoals, and underwater obstacles that appear on no charts because nobody's bothered to map them yet. The primary navigation tool is the compass, a brass instrument mounted near the wheel that theoretically points north and allows the captain to maintain a consistent heading. The captain checks it constantly, making minor adjustments to keep the vessel on course across Lake Erie toward Buffalo. Simple enough, except that iron ore cargo, like the several hundred tons sitting in your hold, can affect compass readings through magnetic interference, which means the captain is using a tool that might be lying to him by several degrees. He compensates for this through experience, knowing roughly how much his compass lies when carrying iron versus lumber versus grain, but it's not an exact science. It's more like educated guessing backed by decades of not dying. The mainstream historical fact that explains why Great Lakes navigation is uniquely challenging, unlike ocean navigation where deep water extends for thousands of miles, the Great Lakes are relatively shallow with countless underwater hazards including rocky shoals, sandbars, reefs, and submerged wrecks from previous vessels that miscalculated. Lake Erie averages only 62 feet deep, with some shipping channels running through water barely 20 feet deep, when a loaded schooner draws 12 to 15 feet. You're essentially sailing through a minefield where the mines are made of rock and shift position with storms and currents. Captain Morrison navigates primarily by memory, a mental map accumulated over 30 years of sailing these waters that includes the location of every major hazard, the depth of every channel, and the appearance of every landmark along hundreds of miles of shoreline. He knows that the reef off Point Pelly extends 3 miles into Lake Erie and has claimed dozens of vessels. He knows that the Detroit River narrows to barely a quarter mile in some spots, with currents strong enough to push a vessel sideways into obstacles. He knows which Cleveland breakwaters have rocky foundations that extend underwater farther than they appear. And he knows all of this without consulting charts, because his charts are 15 years old and possibly inaccurate to begin with. The US government does produce navigational charts of the Great Lakes, updated periodically by survey vessels that measure depths and mark hazards. But acquiring current charts costs money, and many captains simply rely on their memory instead. Captain Morrison has charts, which you've seen rolled up in his cabin, but he consults them mainly for areas he doesn't sail frequently. For the Buffalo-Cleveland-Detroit triangle that constitutes most of his routes, the charts stay rolled up while he steers by instinct, experience, and the occasional prayer when visibility drops. At night, navigation becomes even more interesting, because you're now traveling through darkness across waters dotted with hazards that would sink you in minutes. The captain uses celestial navigation, steering by the North Star and other constellations that he learned to read as a young sailor. It's the same technique ocean navigators use, except ocean navigators have the luxury of deep water, where minor course errors don't immediately result in hitting something. On the lakes, if the captain's star sighting is off by even a degree, you might run aground on a shoal that's invisible in the darkness. Fun times for everyone aboard. Historians still argue whether the high casualty rate among Great Lakes vessels was primarily due to storms or navigation errors, but the evidence suggests both contributed significantly. Many vessels survived storms only to run aground in the confusion, while others struck obstacles in calm weather because captains miscalculated their position or relied on outdated information. The quirky detail that makes navigation even more complicated. The Great Lakes have no tides in the ocean sense, but they do have seiches, standing waves caused by wind and atmospheric pressure that can raise or lower water levels by several feet over hours or days. This means the depth under your keel can change significantly, depending on recent weather, turning a previously safe channel into a grounding hazard. Captain Morrison checks the water level at each port, notes whether it's unusually high or low, and adjusts his mental calculations accordingly. It's like playing chess on a board that occasionally changes the rules mid-game. During daylight in clear weather, the captain also navigates by landmark recognition, identifying specific buildings, church steeples, lighthouses, and distinctive shoreline features that confirm his position. "That's the Cleveland Waterworks Tower," he'll say, pointing to a structure on the receding shore. "We're right where we should be." Later, as you pass islands in western Lake Erie, he'll name them without consulting maps. "That's Kelly's Island, Middle Bass beyond it, South Bass to starboard in another hour." His mental database includes hundreds of such landmarks accumulated through endless repetitions of these routes. The vessel also carries a lead line, a weighted rope marked at regular intervals that can be lowered over the side to measure water depth when approaching shallow areas. You'll learn to heave the lead, calling out depths to the captain, by the mark 5, meaning 5 fathoms or 30 feet under the keel. When the depth starts decreasing, the captain knows he's approaching shore or a shoal and adjusts course accordingly. It's primitive but effective, assuming the person heaving the lead is competent and the captain trusts the readings. Given that you're still learning which end of the rope goes overboard, your depth readings should probably be taken with skepticism. The vessel's speed is estimated by dead reckoning. The captain observes how fast the water passes the hull, notes the wind strength, and calculates approximate speed based on experience. Combined with compass heading and time elapsed, this gives a rough estimate of position, rough being the key word. The margin for error is substantial, but when you're travelling maybe 6 miles per hour in a straight line across open water, small errors don't compound too quickly. It's only when approaching land, obstacles, or other vessels that precision becomes critical, and that's when the captain's experience earns its value. Captain Morrison stands at the wheel now, hand resting casually on the spoke, eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced attention of someone who survived by noticing details others miss. He's steering toward Buffalo by memory, compass, and confidence, gambling his life and yours on knowledge accumulated through decades of trial and error. The successful trials you're benefiting from, the errors are on the bottom of the lake. You're 2 hours out from Cleveland, making good time toward Buffalo across Lake Erie's deceptively calm surface, when First Mate Johansson points to the western horizon and says 2 words that make your stomach drop. Weather's coming. You look where he's pointing and see what appears to be a dark smudge against the blue sky, like someone spilled ink across the horizon. It doesn't look particularly threatening to your untrained eyes, but every experienced sailor on deck has suddenly become very busy preparing for something you don't yet understand. Within 20 minutes, you'll understand perfectly, and you'll spend the rest of your sailing career respecting the Great Lakes' ability to transform from pleasant to apocalyptic with almost no warning. The mainstream historical fact that makes these waters uniquely dangerous. The Great Lakes generate weather systems that combine the worst aspects of ocean storms with the particular hazards of shallow inland seas. Storms develop rapidly because the lakes are surrounded by land masses that create temperature differentials and pressure systems. Waves become steep and chaotic because the relatively shallow water doesn't allow swells to organize into the rolling patterns you'd see on oceans. And there's nowhere to run. You're surrounded by hundreds of miles of coastline, much of it rocky and deadly, with limited safe harbours spaced far enough apart that reaching shelter during a sudden storm is often impossible. Captain Morrison takes the wheel personally, which is never a good sign. "All hands secure the deck," he shouts. "Reef the topsails, prepare for heavy weather." You've been aboard long enough to understand maybe half of those commands, but you follow the experienced sailors and start doing what they're doing, tying down anything loose, closing hatches, and checking that the cargo is properly secured. The iron ore in the hold suddenly feels less like valuable freight and more like thousands of pounds of unstable ballast that could shift and capsize the vessel if the seas get rough enough. The wind arrives first, not gradually building but hitting like a physical blow that makes the Northern Star heel over sharply to starboard. The sails, which were pulling gently minutes ago, are now straining against their rigging with forces that make the masts visibly bend. You're sent aloft with 2 other sailors to reef the topsails. That means reducing sail area by partially lowering and securing the upper canvas, and climbing the ratlines in this wind is like ascending a ladder during an earthquake. The ropes swing violently, the mast sways, and you're acutely aware that falling from this height into water, this cold means you're dead whether you hit the deck or the lake first. You reach the yard, the horizontal spar holding the topsail, and cling to it while fighting with canvas that's snapping and cracking in the wind like artillery fire. The other sailors are wrestling with their sections, trying to tie reef points that will secure the partially furled sail, and you're mimicking their movements with hands that are already numb from gripping frozen rigging. Below you, the deck looks terrifyingly small and far away. The lake looks close and angry. You focus on the knots, the canvas, the immediate task, because thinking about the bigger picture, that you're suspended 60 feet above a storm-tossed deck, would paralyze you completely. By the time you've descended back to the deck, gasping and shaking, the waves have arrived. Lake Erie was glass-smooth an hour ago. Now it's producing 8-foot swells that are steep, choppy, and coming from multiple directions at once. The Northern Star is climbing up one side of a wave, hanging at the crest for a heart-stopping moment, then sliding down into the trough with a motion that makes your stomach float. Green water crashes over the bow, sweeping the deck and making everything slippery and treacherous. You grab a safety line, a rope stretched along the deck specifically for holding onto during moments like this, and clip your belt to it, because sailors who don't stay attached tend to get swept overboard and never seen again. Historians still argue whether Great Lakes storms killed more sailors than ocean storms of equivalent intensity, but the statistics suggest the lakes were deadlier, partly because vessels were smaller and more vulnerable, partly because captains took more risks knowing ports were theoretically close by, and partly because the steep, chaotic wave patterns made it harder for ships to maintain stability and forward momentum. The quirky detail that experienced sailors know but you're learning right now: freshwater waves feel different than saltwater waves because they're less buoyant. When green water crashes over the deck, it doesn't drain away as quickly as ocean spray would. Instead, it sloshes around, heavy and cold, adding weight to the vessel and making everything more dangerous. You're soaked within minutes, and the water isn't just wet. It's shockingly cold, even in spring, maybe 45 degrees, cold enough that if you went overboard, you'd have perhaps 10 minutes of useful consciousness before hypothermia shut you down. The storm lasts 4 hours that feel like 4 days. The Northern Star labours through wave after wave, her wooden hull creaking in patterns that first mate Johansen listens to with the attention of a doctor monitoring a patient's heartbeat. Sometimes the vessel shudders in a way that feels wrong, and Johansen will adjust course slightly, giving the ship a better angle to the waves. Captain Morrison stands at the wheel, soaked and exhausted but maintaining control, steering through the chaos with minute adjustments that keep the vessel from being broadsided by waves that could roll you over. You spend those 4 hours pumping bilge water. The storm has opened seams in the hull that were previously just weeping, and now water is pouring in faster than the normal leakage rate. You and Murphy work the pump in shifts, 30 minutes on and 30 minutes off, because pumping continuously in these conditions would break you physically. The discharge stream is constant, gallons per minute flowing out even as more water finds its way in. The ship is fighting to stay afloat, and you're part of that fight whether you're ready or not. And this is just a spring squall, a minor storm by Great Lakes standards. The real terror comes in November, during the fall gale season, when storms generate waves measured in stories not feet, when temperatures drop below freezing and spray turns to ice on the rigging, adding weight that can capsize a vessel or snap masts. November is when experienced captains start making hard choices about whether to push for one more cargo run or lay up for winter. November is when insurance rates spike. November is when the bottom of these lakes collects another year's worth of vessels that thought they could make it. The storm passes as suddenly as it arrived, leaving behind exhausted sailors, a battered vessel, and water that returns to merely choppy instead of actively homicidal. You've survived your first real weather, and you understand now why sailors speak of the Great Lakes with respect that borders on fear. The storm has passed, the sun is making a tentative reappearance, and you might think this means you can finally rest, but congratulations. You've just learned the fundamental truth of sailing vessel operation. A ship is basically a wooden machine that's actively trying to destroy itself, and your job is to slow that destruction through constant, exhausting, never-ending maintenance. The day after the storm, First Mate Johansen surveys the damage with the resigned expression of someone who's done this ritual hundreds of times, and starts assigning repairs that will occupy every spare moment for the next week. Welcome to the part of sailing they don't mention in the romantic maritime novels. You're basically a full-time maintenance worker who occasionally gets to experience the thrill of not drowning. The rigging inspection comes first, and you're sent aloft again, this time in calmer conditions, which is a mercy, to check every line, every block, every connection point for damage from yesterday's stress. The Norwegian sailor who's supervising this task explains the grim reality. Rope doesn't last forever, especially rope that's been alternately soaked in fresh water, baked in sun, frozen in cold, and stressed by wind loads that approach its breaking point. Every line on this vessel has a finite lifespan, and your job is to identify which ropes are approaching death before they fail at a critical moment and kill someone. No pressure. You find 3 lines that are showing dangerous wear. The outer fibers are frayed, exposing the inner core, which means there may be 70% of original strength and dropping. These get marked for replacement, which means splicing in new sections or completely replacing the line, both of which are skilled jobs that you haven't learned yet but will be observing so you can eventually do them yourself. The mainstream historical fact that explains why rope maintenance is crucial. Most sailing vessel accidents involved rigging failures, a snapped halyard dropping a sail, a parted sheet allowing a sail to swing wildly, a broken stay causing a mast to collapse. Strong rope was literally the difference between life and death, which is why experienced sailors developed almost obsessive habits around rope inspection and maintenance. Once the dangerous lines are identified and marked, you descend to help with the actual maintenance work, which begins with tar. Tar is the miracle substance that keeps wooden ships from falling apart. It waterproofs wood, preserves rope, and seals gaps in the hull. And it has to be applied constantly because it wears away through exposure to water, sun, and use. The process involves heating pine tar in a pot until it's liquid enough to apply, but not so hot it catches fire. That's happened before, according to Murphy, who shares the story with obvious relish, then brushing it onto rope, wood, and any other surface that needs waterproofing. You're assigned to tar the standing rigging, the permanent lines that support the masts, which means climbing around the vessel's network of ropes with a brush and a bucket of sticky, smelly tar, applying it to hemp fibers that absorb it like a sponge. The tar is black, viscous, and gets absolutely everywhere. On your hands, your clothes, your face, probably in your hair. The smell is somewhere between turpentine and a forest fire, and it lingers in your nostrils for days. You'll never again smell pine tar without being transported back to this moment, standing on a ratline 60 feet above the deck, coating rope with liquid that's trying to drip on everyone below you. The work is tedious and endless. There are miles of rope on a 3-masted schooner, and all of it needs tar eventually. You spend hours on this single task, and by the time Johansson declares it's sufficient, your hands are black claws and you smell like a tar pit. Good work, he says, which is basically a declaration of love by his standards. Tomorrow we'll start on the running rigging. Tomorrow's tar party sounds delightful. Next comes rust removal, because the Northern Star is held together partly by wooden components and partly by iron fittings, chains, bolts, hinges, anchors, that rust with enthusiasm in the wet environment of a lake vessel. You're given scrapers, wire brushes and sandpaper, then pointed at a section of anchor chain that's developed a coating of rust thick enough to measure. Your job is to scrape it down to bare metal, then apply oil to slow the inevitable return of oxidation. It's mindless work that destroys your hands. The rust comes off in flakes that cut your fingers, the wire brush tears skin, and the scraper slips, occasionally engouges whatever body part is currently in its path. Orchestrated maritime maintenance narrative with sensory richness. I need to continue with more maintenance tasks, patching sails, pumping bilge, general repairs. Include the scholarly debate phrase, more sensory details, and keep the tone consistent. Historians still argue whether the constant maintenance requirements of wooden sailing vessels represented sound preventive practices or whether ship owners were simply operating vessels beyond their reasonable service life. But from your current position, scraping rust off a chain that's probably older than you are, the distinction seems academic. Either way, you're the one doing the work while the owners are on land counting money. The sail inspection reveals what everyone already suspected. Yesterday's storm opened several small tears in the canvas that need patching before they become large tears. You're sent to help the able-bodied seamen who actually know how to sew sailcloth, which involves needles the size of tent stakes, waxed thread that could probably tow a carriage, and a leather palm protector that you wear on your hand to push the needle through multiple layers of heavy canvas. The experienced sailors make it look easy, their needles moving in rhythmic patterns that create tight, strong stitches. Your attempts produce something that technically holds the canvas together but probably won't survive the next storm. It's a start, Hansen offers diplomatically. You'll get better, or you'll ruin enough sails that will make you good through sheer necessity. Between these major tasks, there's the constant, never-ending job of pumping bilge water. The storm-opened seams that haven't fully closed, and the Northern Star is taking on water at maybe twice her normal rate, perhaps 100 gallons per hour instead of the usual 50. This means the pumps need to be worked more frequently, with someone on the handle every hour during the day watch and every 2 hours at night. You take your turns at the pump, working the handle up and down in the rhythm you're starting to know by heart, watching murky water stream out through the discharge pipe, trying not to think about how you're literally keeping the ship from sinking through manual labour that never ends. The quirky detail that reveals how much maintenance work actually happens. Naval historians estimate that Great Lakes sailors in the 1870s spent roughly 60% of their time on maintenance and repairs, 30% on cargo operations, and only 10% on actual sailing activities. You joined a ship thinking you'd be a romantic sailor conquering the waves. You're actually a floating maintenance technician who occasionally travels between repair locations. You also spend time that afternoon on what Johansson calls general upkeep, which is code for fixing all the small things that are breaking before they become big things. This includes recorking deck seams where the oakum has worked loose, tightening bolts that have vibrated loose from constant motion, oiling hinges on hatches, checking the security of the ship's boat that's lashed amidships, inspecting the life rings that probably won't save anyone but make everyone feel better, and replacing worn cleats that secure lines. Every component of the vessel requires attention, and if you ignore something today, it will definitely demand attention tomorrow, usually at the worst possible moment. By evening, you're exhausted from work that never involved actually sailing the ship. You've been climbing, scraping, brushing, sewing, pumping, and fixing for 12 hours, and the Northern Star is maybe 2% better maintained than she was this morning. Tomorrow you'll do it again, and the day after, and every day for the rest of the season, in a cycle that never truly ends because entropy is relentless, and wooden ships are entropy's favourite victims. You collapse into your bunk that night smelling of tar and rust, your hands cut and blistered, your muscles screaming, and drift off to sleep knowing that somewhere on this vessel, something is already breaking that you'll need to fix tomorrow. You're hauling iron ore on this particular run, but over the course of a season, the Northern Star will transport an astonishing variety of cargo that represents nothing less than the Industrial Revolution in portable form. These aren't luxury goods or exotic spices. You're moving the raw materials and finished products that are building modern America, feeding its cities and fueling its factories. Every ton of freight in your hold has a destination where it's desperately needed, and the entire economic system of the Great Lakes region depends on vessels like yours making their runs on schedule, safely and profitably. The fact that your life is literally riding on top of these cargoes adds a certain incentive to handle them properly. Iron ore, like what you're currently carrying, comes primarily from Michigan's Upper Peninsula mines and travels to steel mills in Cleveland, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh. It's dense, heavy, and unglamorous. Chunks of reddish-brown rock that weigh about 160 pounds per cubic foot, which means your hold is currently packed with maybe 400 tons of material that would sink you in seconds if the hull gave way. The ore sits low in the vessel, providing good ballast that keeps the Northern Star stable even in rough seas, but it's also prone to shifting if not properly distributed. During that storm yesterday, you heard the ominous rumble of ore settling and sliding in the hold, and First Mate Johansson's face went pale for a moment before the sound stopped. Cargo shift is one of the fastest ways to capsize a vessel. The weight moves to one side, the ship lists, water comes over the rail, and suddenly you're going down with no time to even consider swimming. Grain is another common cargo, particularly in autumn, when the wheat harvest comes in from farms across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois. You've heard stories about grain cargoes from the able-bodied seamen, and none of them are comforting. Grain flows like liquid when the hold is being loaded, filling every space and appearing stable, but it can shift catastrophically in rough weather, creating the same capsizing risk as ore, but with the added joy of fermentation gases. Grain that gets wet starts fermenting, producing methane and carbon dioxide that can asphyxiate sailors who go down into the hold to check the cargo. It can also explode if the gas concentration gets high enough and someone introduces a spark, so you're potentially sailing on top of a bomb made of wheat. Pleasant dreams tonight. The mainstream historical fact that explains why these cargoes matter. The Great Lakes shipping network in the 1870s moved approximately 20 million tons of cargo annually, including most of the iron ore feeding America's steel industry, much of the grain feeding its eastern cities, and vast quantities of lumber building its expansion westward. Without these vessels making their runs, the industrial economy would have ground to a halt. You're not just a sailor, you're a critical component in a supply chain that stretches from mines in Michigan to steel mills in Pennsylvania, from farms in Wisconsin to bakeries in New York. Lumber is considered the easiest cargo to handle, which is why you're relieved when the Northern Star picks up lumber loads. Pine, oak, and hardwoods cut from the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin get stacked in the hold and often on deck as well, creating a wooden mountain that rises above the rail. It's lighter than ore or grain, it doesn't shift as dramatically, and it won't asphyxiate you with mysterious gases. The only downside is that if you capsize while carrying lumber, the wood can trap you underwater. Survivors from lumber vessel sinkings have reported fighting their way through logs that pinned them below the surface. But compared to fermented grain or shifting ore, you'll take your chances with lumber every time. Coal moves through these waters constantly, heading from Pennsylvania mines to cities around the lakes. It's dirty cargo that leaves everything coated in black dust, including your lungs, but it's relatively stable in the hold and doesn't require special handling beyond the usual concern about weight distribution. Some vessels specialize in coal transport. Others, like the Northern Star, take coal cargoes when nothing better is available and spend weeks afterward trying to clean the residue from every surface. Historians still argue whether the diversity of cargo types on Great Lakes vessels represented economic flexibility, or whether it indicated that individual vessels were too small and undercapitalized to specialize, but either way, you're sailing on a floating truck that hauls whatever pays this week. The Northern Star is theoretically capable of carrying lumber, grain, ore, coal, finished goods, or passengers, though Captain Morrison avoids passenger transport because, as he puts it, cargo doesn't complain when dinner is late. The quirky detail about cargo handling that you'll learn through painful experience: different cargoes require different loading patterns to maintain stability. Ore needs to be spread evenly at the bottom. Grain needs to be kept dry and monitored for shifting. Lumber needs to be lashed securely if it's on deck. Coal needs to be isolated from other cargoes to prevent contamination. And mixed cargoes, carrying multiple types on one voyage, require careful planning to ensure the heavy materials stay low and the weight distribution remains balanced. Captain Morrison and First Mate Johansen have mental databases of proper loading patterns accumulated through years of trial and error, with emphasis on the errors that almost sank them. The economic reality of these cargoes is that your wages depend on the vessel making successful deliveries. Captain Morrison gets paid by the ton delivered, which means he's incentivized to pack as much cargo as possible and complete runs quickly. The crew gets paid by the month, which means you want the season to last as long as possible. More months at sea equals more total wages. These conflicting incentives create interesting dynamics where the captain wants to push through dangerous weather to maintain schedule, while the crew would prefer to wait for safer conditions. But nobody's asking the crew's opinion because that's not how maritime hierarchy works, remember? You're currently sleeping on top of iron ore worth thousands of dollars, destined for a steel mill that will transform it into rails for the expanding railroad network. That lumber you delivered to Cleveland will become houses in growing suburbs. The grain you'll carry next month will feed families who've never seen a farm. The coal you hauled last trip is currently heating homes and powering factories. You're part of a logistics network that's literally building America, one cargo at a time, and the fact that this network occasionally kills its workers through drowning, crushing, or asphyxiation is apparently just the cost of doing business. Your life depends on this cargo being properly loaded, remaining stable during transport, and not developing any of the various creative ways that bulk materials can kill sailors. Sleep well with that knowledge. You're 3 weeks into the season when you witness your first serious accident, and it happens so quickly that your brain needs several seconds to catch up with what your eyes just saw. One moment, Hansen, the able-bodied seaman who's been teaching you proper rope coiling, is working on the foredeck adjusting a line that's been chafing against the rail. The next moment, a sheet that's under tension from the wind suddenly parts with a sound like a gunshot, and the loose end whips across the deck with enough force to shatter bone. Hansen sees it coming and throws himself backward, but not quite fast enough. The rope catches him across the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into the capstan with a sickening thud that you hear even over the wind noise. He's lucky. The rope hit his shoulder instead of his head, which means he's probably only fractured something instead of dead. First Mate Johansen is there in seconds, assessing the damage with the clinical efficiency of someone who's seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times. Hansen's shoulder is already swelling, his arm hanging at an angle that arms shouldn't hang, and his face has gone the particular shade of grey-white that indicates serious pain being barely controlled. "Dislocated," Johansen announces. "Possibly broken. Get him below." 2 sailors help Hansen down to the forecastle while you stand on deck, still processing how a routine task became a medical emergency in the span of maybe 2 seconds. The mainstream historical fact that should concern you: casualty rates for Great Lakes sailors in the 1870s were approximately 1 in 50 per season, meaning that if you sailed for multiple years, you had a statistically significant chance of being seriously injured or killed. These weren't just drowning deaths from shipwrecks. They included accidents from cargo handling, rigging failures, falls from height, being struck by equipment, and the countless creative ways that manual labor on a moving platform can destroy the human body. You're working in what would be considered an extremely high-risk occupation by any standard, and there's no safety equipment beyond your own vigilance and luck. Hansen's accident is the kind of injury you can survive, assuming it heals properly and doesn't develop infection, but it's removed him from active duty for weeks. He's now essentially cargo, still on the vessel but unable to work, still consuming food but not contributing labour. Captain Morrison is visibly annoyed, not because he lacks sympathy, but because an injured crew member means the remaining sailors have to work harder to compensate. You're now doing Hansen's share of the maintenance work on top of your own duties, which means you're even more exhausted than usual, and possibly more prone to making the kind of mistake that leads to becoming the next casualty. The real terror of working on these vessels isn't the dramatic disasters, the shipwrecks and storms that make headlines. It's the constant mundane ways the job tries to kill you. Wet decks are slippery, and a missed step can send you overboard into water that's cold enough to induce cardiac arrest within minutes. Ropes under tension can snap without warning, turning into whips that move faster than you can react. Cargo can shift and crush you against bulkheads. Heavy equipment like anchor chains or cargo booms can swing unpredictably in the ship's motion, catching you if you're in the wrong place. And working aloft, climbing around in the rigging 60 or 80 feet above the deck, means that any handhold failure or balance error results in a fall that's either immediately fatal or leaves you so broken that you wish it had been. The Norwegian sailor, who survived 15 seasons, shares his philosophy during your next watch together. The lakes don't kill you with one big mistake, they kill you with small mistakes that add up. You grab a rat line without checking if it's secure, you step on deck without looking for loose equipment, you work aloft while tired. Each mistake alone might not hurt you, but you make 10 mistakes in a day, and eventually the math catches up. He shows you scars on his hands, arms, and one particularly impressive one on his ribs. Every scar is a lesson. The sailors without scars either learned fast or died young. Historians still argue whether the high accident rates on commercial sailing vessels reflected inadequate safety standards or simply the inherent dangers of the work, but from your current position as someone who could become a statistic at any moment, the academic debate seems less important than the practical question of how to survive until the end of the season. The quirky detail that reveals how casually dangerous this work is: most Great Lakes sailors carried their personal effects in a single small bag, partly because there wasn't storage space, but also because it made it easier for the crew to send your belongings home when you died. Your entire life reduced to a bag that someone else would pack and ship to whatever family address you'd listed when signing on. The Norwegian has already asked you where to send your things, if it comes to that, and you've done the same for him. It's not morbid, it's practical planning in an occupation where death is a workplace hazard. The cold water is possibly the most insidious danger because it's always there, surrounding you, waiting for any opportunity to pull you in. Lake Erie in May is maybe 50 degrees, cold enough that if you fall overboard, you have perhaps 15 to 30 minutes before hypothermia incapacitates you. That sounds like plenty of time for rescue, except that a sailing vessel can't just stop and reverse course instantly. By the time the crew realizes someone's missing, lowers a boat, rows back to where they think you went over, and searches the area, you're probably already unconscious and sinking. The standing rule aboard the Northern Star is that if someone goes overboard, you throw them a life ring and hope they can grab it while the ship comes about. But nobody pretends this is a reliable rescue method. Mostly it's a ritual that makes everyone feel slightly less helpless about the reality that sailors who go into the water typically don't come back out. Murphy shares a story about his cousin who went overboard in calm weather off the Detroit River, fell while adjusting a sail, hit the water cleanly, surfaced immediately, and waved to the crew to show he was fine. The vessel was turning around to pick him up maybe 3 minutes had elapsed, and they watched him the entire time. But the cold water was sapping his strength faster than expected, and by the time they reached him he'd gone under. They spent an hour dragging hooks through the water, but the Detroit River flows into Lake Erie with a current strong enough that his body probably travelled miles before it settled. He was 23 years old, an experienced sailor, and he drowned in broad daylight with his entire crew watching. That's when I learned the lakes don't care about your experience or your luck, Murphy says. They just care about the temperature of the water and how long you can survive it. You clip your safety line more carefully after hearing that story, and you check your knots twice before trusting them. Small precautions that might make the difference or might just give you false confidence before the lakes find a creative new way to kill you. Either way, you're learning that survival isn't about one big heroic moment. It's about making correct small decisions hundreds of times per day and hoping that the one time you make a wrong decision isn't the time it matters most. You've been working aboard the Northern Star for a month now, and you're starting to wonder when you'll actually see any of that $25 the shipping agent promised you back in Buffalo. The answer, you're about to discover, involves a creative accounting system that would make a riverboat gambler proud, where your theoretical wages are subjected to so many deductions that your actual take-home pay resembles something closer to spare change than a living wage. Welcome to the economic reality of Great Lakes sailing, where the work is dangerous, the conditions are miserable, and somehow you're still expected to feel grateful for the opportunity to be systematically fleeced by your employers. The $25 per month sounded reasonable when you signed on. It's better than factory work, better than farm labour, enough to live on if you're careful. What the shipping agent neglected to mention is that this is your gross pay, before the captain starts exercising his right to deduct for various services and supplies that you're required to use. Your first hint that something's wrong comes when you ask first mate Johansson about payment schedules, and he laughs, not unkindly, but with the weary amusement of someone who's had this conversation with every new sailor for 20 years. You'll get your settlement at the end of the season, he says, after deductions. Those deductions, you're learning, are extensive and creative. First, there's your bunk in the forecastle, that damp, cramped wooden shelf that you're sharing with rats. The captain charges $2 per month for this luxury accommodation, which works out to about 7 cents per day for the privilege of sleeping in what's essentially a leaky closet. You try to argue that the bunk is a necessary part of working on the vessel, not an optional amenity, but Johansson just shrugs. Take it up with the captain if you want. I'm sure he'll be very understanding. The sarcasm is thick enough to cut with a knife. Next comes food. Chen's masterpieces of salt pork and hardtack aren't free. The captain charges $5 per month for board, which is allegedly at cost but probably includes a healthy profit margin. You're paying roughly 17 cents per day for meals that consist primarily of ingredients that were cheap when they were purchased months ago and have only gotten cheaper through age and decay. The fresh bread that seemed like such a luxury in your first week, that's coming out of your wages. The coffee that keeps you functional during the night watches, also deducted. Even the water you drink is technically coming from a supply that the captain purchased, so arguably you're paying for that too, though at least he hasn't started itemizing it yet. The mainstream historical fact that explains this system: Great Lakes shipping companies in the 1870s frequently used advance notes and deduction systems that kept sailors in perpetual debt to their vessels, ensuring a captive labour force that couldn't afford to quit mid-season. While not quite company town scrip, the effect was similar. Sailors ended the season with barely enough money to survive the winter, guaranteeing they'd need to sign on again next spring. The system was designed to extract maximum labour for minimum actual payment, and it worked depressingly well. Then there are the equipment charges for anything you've borrowed from the ship's stores. Those leather gloves you used while loading iron ore? $1 deducted from your pay. The oilskin coat you needed during the storm? $2. The extra blanket you requested after discovering your original one was more holes than fabric? 50 cents. Never mind that this equipment is necessary for performing your job safely. If you use it, you pay for it. First mate Johansson mentions that experienced sailors bring their own equipment to avoid these charges, but since you didn't know that before signing on, you're stuck paying the ship's marked up prices for basic necessities. Medical treatment, should you need it, is also deducted. Hansen, who's currently recovering from his dislocated shoulder, will have the cost of whatever treatment the captain provides deducted from his wages. Not that the treatment is particularly sophisticated or expensive, but the principle stands. You get injured while working for the ship, and then you pay for the privilege of receiving minimal medical care afterward. The logic is circular and exploitative, but it's perfectly legal under maritime law. There are also port fees that the captain occasionally assesses, charges for docking, for using port facilities, for loading equipment, that somehow get partially passed along to the crew, even though these are operating expenses that should be covered by the shipping company. The accounting is deliberately opaque, and questioning it is a good way to find yourself on the captain's bad side, which is not a place you want to be when he controls everything from your work assignments to your food portions. You're starting to do the math in your head, and it's not encouraging. $25 per month, -2 for the bunk, -5 for food, minus equipment charges averaging maybe $2 per month, minus miscellaneous deductions that will probably add up to another $1 or $2. You're looking at actual take-home pay of maybe $15 per month, and that's if the captain doesn't find additional reasons to dock your wages for perceived infractions, damaged equipment, or time spent in port when you should have been working. Historians still argue whether the wage deduction system represented legitimate cost recovery or systematic exploitation of sailors who had little bargaining power. But from your current position as someone watching their theoretical wages evaporate through accounting tricks, the distinction seems academic. Either way, you're working dangerous jobs for 12 to 16 hours a day and ending up with barely enough money to survive. The quirky detail that makes this system even more exploitative. Many captains wouldn't provide any wages until the end of the season, meaning sailors who quit or were fired mid-season might receive nothing at all for weeks or months of work. The threat of losing accumulated unpaid wages kept sailors aboard even when conditions became intolerable. You're essentially working on credit, hoping the captain will eventually pay what he owes, with no legal recourse if he decides your performance didn't meet his standards and reduces your final settlement accordingly. The able-bodied seaman makes slightly better wages, $35 or $40 per month before deductions, which means they might actually end up with $25 in hand at season's end. First Mate Johansson makes maybe $60 per month, though he's also responsible for basically running the ship, so he earns it. Captain Morrison, with his ownership stake and his share of cargo profits, makes vastly more than everyone else combined. The economic pyramid is steep and obvious, and you're very firmly at the bottom. The real trap is that these wages, inadequate as they are still better than what you could make in many shore jobs, especially if you're unskilled labour with no particular training. The shipping companies know this, which is why they can get away with the deduction system. Sailors will accept exploitation because the alternative is worse, exploitation somewhere else. It's a race to the bottom where everyone's losing except the ship owners who somehow keep getting richer. You're also learning that the season only lasts about 7 or 8 months, from April when the ice clears until November when it returns. That means even if you make $15 per month after deductions, you're earning maybe $105 to $120 for the entire year, assuming you work every month without getting injured or fired. That's barely enough to survive the winter when there's no work, which means you'll be back at the docks next spring, desperate enough to accept whatever terms the shipping agents offer. The cycle continues, year after year, until you either advance to better positions, find different work, or die in a storm. Welcome to the economic reality of Great Lakes shipping, where the hazard pay doesn't actually exist, and your wages barely cover your mandatory expenses. You make a mental note to bring your own equipment next season, assuming you survive this one. The Northern Star ties up at Milwaukee's docks on a warm June evening, and Captain Morrison announces that you'll have shore leave until dawn, approximately 10 hours of freedom from the vessel, the watches, and the constant maintenance work. This should be cause for celebration, except you're about to discover that port cities have developed entire economic ecosystems specifically designed to separate sailors from their meagre wages as efficiently as possible. Within walking distance of every Great Lakes dock, you'll find a concentration of saloons, boarding houses, cheap restaurants, and various entertainment establishments that exist solely to extract money from men who've been at sea for weeks and are desperate for anything that resembles normal life. Welcome to shore leave, where your brief escape from the ship becomes a different kind of exploitation. The waterfront district in Milwaukee, like every port city from Buffalo to Chicago, has a particular character that's simultaneously exciting and slightly threatening. The streets nearest the docks are lined with businesses that cater exclusively to maritime workers, saloons with names like the Sailor's Rest and the Lake Breeze, boarding houses advertising clean rooms, 50 cents, restaurants promising hot meals, fast service, and establishments with vague names like Gentleman's Social Club that aren't fooling anyone about their actual purpose. Painted signs compete for attention, promising the best prices, the strongest drinks, the most comfortable beds, and various other superlatives that are probably all lies. The air smells like coal smoke, cooking food, spilled beer, and the particular desperation of capitalism in its most concentrated form. You and Murphy head toward the nearest saloon, a place called the Anchor Inn that looks marginally less likely to rob you than its competitors, and push through doors into a crowded room thick with tobacco smoke and noise. The bar runs along one wall, staffed by bartenders who can pour drinks and make change simultaneously while monitoring the room for trouble. Tables fill the centre space, occupied by sailors from various vessels, dock workers, and local residents who apparently enjoy the atmosphere of controlled chaos. A piano player in the corner is producing music that's technically competent, but competing with too many conversations to be properly appreciated. This is as close to entertainment as you'll get for the next several months. The mainstream historical fact about waterfront saloons: these establishments served crucial social functions for maritime workers beyond just selling alcohol. They operated as informal employment exchanges where captains recruited crew, as mail drops where sailors could receive letters, as banking services where money could be held safely, and as social spaces where information about jobs, vessels, and captains was exchanged. A well-run waterfront saloon was part of the maritime infrastructure, though that didn't stop most of them from also being exploitative businesses that overcharged their customers at every opportunity. Beer costs 10 cents, which is roughly double what you'd pay a few blocks inland. But arguing about prices in a sailor's bar is pointless. You either pay their rates, or you don't drink. You order a beer, receive it in a glass that's probably been rinsed rather than washed, and find a spot to stand near the wall. The beer is cold, which is its primary virtue, and the taste is secondary to the psychological benefit of consuming something that isn't ship's coffee or questionable water. Murphy's already on his second beer, chatting with sailors from another vessel about weather conditions, cargo rates, and which captains are worth sailing under. This informal intelligence network is how experienced sailors navigate the job market. Reputation travels faster than any newspaper could carry it. The bartender is keeping a careful eye on the room, particularly watching for the crimps and land sharks. Operators who specialize in getting sailors drunk, running up their tabs and then helping them sign onto vessels while they're too intoxicated to negotiate terms. It's a form of involuntary recruitment that's technically illegal but widely practiced, and it's particularly effective on sailors who've just been paid and are celebrating their temporary wealth. You're nursing your single beer carefully, aware that your $15 in expected end-of-season wages won't go far if you start spending freely now. After an hour in the saloon, you and Murphy decide to find food that isn't salt pork, a revolutionary concept that's almost worth the shore leave by itself. You find a small restaurant 2 blocks from the docks advertising home-cooked meals, and for 25 cents you receive a plate of beef stew with actual vegetables, bread that's fresh enough to be soft, and coffee that doesn't taste like it was filtered through bilge water. It's the best meal you've eaten in weeks, and you consume it with the enthusiasm of someone who's been subsisting on maritime rations designed more for preservation than palatability. The restaurant owner, a woman in her 50s who's probably feeding sailors as a business model because they're so desperately grateful for real food, watches with satisfaction as you clean your plate. "You boys sail on the Northern Star?" she asks. You confirm it. "Captain Morrison's a decent man," she offers. "Could be worse." This is apparently the highest praise anyone gives to Great Lakes captains. Historians still argue whether the concentration of vice and exploitation in waterfront districts was an inevitable result of serving transient populations with limited time and money, or whether port cities could have regulated these businesses more effectively to protect maritime workers. But from your current position as someone with 10 hours of freedom and limited funds, the debate seems less important than deciding how to spend your remaining time and money wisely. The quirky detail about shore leave that experienced sailors know: the worst time to hit the port bars is immediately after vessels pay their crews at season's end, because that's when the crimps and thieves are most active, waiting for sailors with actual cash. The safest shore leave is mid-season when nobody has money, and the predatory businesses aren't bothering to work too hard. Right now, in June, you're in that sweet spot where the waterfront is relatively calm and you can actually relax without constantly watching for scams. You spend the rest of your shore leave walking around Milwaukee, enjoying the novelty of solid ground that doesn't move, looking at shop windows displaying goods you can't afford, and generally pretending you're a normal person, rather than someone who sleeps in a damp forecastle and earns $15 per month after deductions. It's pleasant but also vaguely melancholy, a reminder of the life you're not living while you're aboard the Northern Star. By midnight you're back near the docks, and by 4 a.m. you're climbing aboard the vessel, your brief freedom over, ready to resume the cycle of watches and work. Shore leave is temporary escape that reminds you what you're missing, which arguably makes it worse than just staying aboard. But you'll take it anyway, because 10 hours of freedom beats no freedom at all. The Northern Star cast off from Milwaukee at dawn, and as the shoreline recedes into the distance, you're experiencing a form of isolation that's difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Once you're beyond sight of land, heading across open water toward your next destination, you are completely and utterly cut off from the rest of humanity. There's no postal service on Lake Michigan, no telegraph wires stretch across the water, no carrier pigeons trained to find moving vessels. If something happens to your family back home, an illness, a death, a financial crisis, you won't know about it until you reach port, which might be days or weeks away. And if something happens to you, injury, illness, or the ship simply disappearing beneath the waves, your family won't know about it until the vessel fails to arrive at its scheduled destination and someone bothers to investigate. Welcome to the profound loneliness of maritime isolation, where you're simultaneously working alongside 8 other men and completely alone in the ways that matter most. Before leaving Milwaukee, you managed to send a letter home, a brief note written in the boarding house, handed to the postal clerk with 3 cents for postage, and dispatched into the mysterious system that somehow delivers paper across hundreds of miles. You wrote about the work being hard but manageable, about the crew being decent enough, about expecting to make it through the season successfully. All lies, mostly, or at least optimistic interpretations of a reality that's considerably grimmer than you're willing to admit to family members who are already worried about you. You didn't mention Hanson's injury, the storm that nearly swamped you, or the fact that your hands are perpetually torn up from rope work. Why worry them with details they can't change? The letter will reach home in maybe a week, and by then you'll already be hundreds of miles away, unreachable by any return correspondence. The mainstream historical fact that defined maritime communication in this era. Once a vessel left port, it existed in an information void until it reached the next destination. Ships passed each other on the lakes occasionally, and crews might exchange shouted news if the vessels came close enough. But this was unreliable at best. Families of sailors operated on the assumption that no news was good news. If your vessel wasn't reported sunk, you were probably still alive, and that was the best they could hope for. This information gap created profound anxiety for families who spent months wondering if their sailors were dead, injured, or simply working beyond reach of communication. You're thinking about this as the watch progresses, standing at the bow and watching the water slide past the hull. Somewhere back in Buffalo or Cleveland or wherever you call home, people are going about their lives, working their jobs, eating meals, having conversations, completely unaware of where you are or what you're doing. You could be in the middle of a crisis right now, or they could be experiencing an emergency, and there's absolutely no way to bridge that gap. The isolation is psychological as much as physical. You're working in a bubble that's moving across the lakes, disconnected from the normal flow of information and contact that defines human society. The able-bodied seamen seem less bothered by this isolation, probably because they've lived it for years and developed coping mechanisms. The Norwegian mentions that he hasn't seen his family in Sweden in 20 years. He sends money occasionally through international banking arrangements, receives letters perhaps twice a year forwarded through various ports, and otherwise exists in a parallel universe that only intersects with his family's reality through these sparse communications. You get used to it, he says, though his expression suggests that used to it isn't the same as comfortable with it. His wife might be dead, his children grown and moved away, and he wouldn't know until a letter eventually caught up with him months later. That's just the reality of a sailor's life. The younger sailors seem to struggle more with the isolation. The kid who lied about his age is clearly homesick, though he tries to hide it behind bravado and forced enthusiasm for the work. Murphy catches him staring at the shoreline one evening and offers what passes for comfort in this environment. First season's the hardest. Either you make peace with being gone, or you don't come back next year. No shame either way. It's not exactly inspiring, but it's honest, which counts for something. Historians still argue whether the isolation inherent in maritime work contributed to psychological problems among sailors, or whether the transient lifestyle simply attracted men who were already comfortable with disconnection. But from your current position as someone who's actively experiencing that isolation, it feels less like comfort and more like resigned acceptance of an unpleasant reality. The quirky detail that makes the isolation even more pronounced. Great Lakes vessels in the 1870s occasionally disappeared completely, leaving port, never arriving at their destination, with no wreckage ever found and no survivors to explain what happened. Families of those sailors might wait months or even years for official declarations of death, caught in a bureaucratic and emotional limbo where they couldn't move forward because there was no certainty about what had occurred. Your family, if you disappeared this way, would be left wondering forever whether you died in a storm, jumped ship to start a new life, or met some other fate that left no evidence behind. The worst part of the isolation is the inability to receive comfort when you need it. During difficult watches, exhausting work details, or moments when you're questioning every decision that brought you to this vessel, you can't call home for reassurance. You can't receive a letter reminding you why you're doing this work. You're operating entirely on your own internal reserves, with only the camaraderie of fellow sailors who are dealing with their own struggles to sustain you. It's emotionally exhausting in ways that the physical labour isn't. A constant low-grade stress that never quite resolves, because it can't resolve until you reach port. You'll arrive in Chicago in 3 days, where you'll have perhaps a few hours to send another brief letter and check if any mail has caught up with you through the forwarding system. Then you'll cast off again, returning to isolation, and the cycle will continue until the season ends and you finally go home to discover what you've missed during these months of disconnection. You wake up during your off-watch period 3 days out from Chicago, and something is definitely wrong. Your head feels like it's stuffed with cotton, your throat is raw, and you're alternating between shivering under your damp blanket and sweating through your shirt. Congratulations. You've caught something, probably from the combination of constant dampness, inadequate nutrition, exhaustion, and living in close quarters with 8 other men who have varying standards of personal hygiene. Getting sick aboard a Great Lakes schooner is always inconvenient, but it's particularly problematic when you realise that the available medical care consists of Captain Morrison's limited first aid knowledge, whatever folk remedies the crew can suggest, and a medicine chest that's probably older than you are, and contains substances that might have been therapeutic once but are now primarily good for poisoning yourself in creative ways. You drag yourself on deck for your watch, because there's no sick leave policy on a vessel with a minimal crew. You either work or you're dead, and since you're not quite dead yet, Johansson expects you at your station. You spend 4 hours in a feverish haze, performing your duties on autopilot, while your body wages war against whatever infection or virus has taken hold. The other sailors notice you're struggling, but offer only the sympathy available in an environment where everyone's struggling. Murphy brings you extra coffee, the Norwegian suggests you chew on some hardtack to settle your stomach, which makes no sense, but you're too miserable to argue. And Hansen, still recovering from his shoulder injury, offers the reassurance that, if you're not coughing blood, you're probably fine. The mainstream historical fact that should terrify you: medical care aboard commercial vessels in the 1870s was virtually non-existent. Captains were required by law to carry a medicine chest, but they received no formal training in its use, and the contents were often outdated, improperly stored, or simply ineffective against the diseases that actually afflicted sailors. Common ailments included respiratory infections from constant dampness, digestive problems from poor quality, food, injuries from accidents, and occasionally more serious diseases like typhoid or cholera picked up in port. Treatment options range from wait and hope you recover to aggressive intervention that might kill you faster than the disease. By the end of your watch, you're running a serious fever, and First Mate Johansson reluctantly reports your condition to Captain Morrison, who emerges from his cabin with all the enthusiasm of someone being asked to perform surgery with a butter knife. He takes one look at you, sweating, shivering, barely coherent, and makes his professional medical assessment. Fever. Could be anything. Go below and rest. Drink water. If you're not better by tomorrow, we'll try something else. This is apparently the extent of diagnostic medicine available aboard the Northern Star. No thermometer, no physical examination, just observation and hope. The ship's medicine chest is retrieved from the captain's cabin, and it's a wooden box about the size of a small trunk, divided into compartments containing various bottles, tins, and mysterious packages wrapped in waxed paper. Captain Morrison opens it with the air of someone who's not entirely sure what's inside, and starts examining labels written in handwriting that's faded to near illegibility. Laudanum, he reads. That's for pain. Calomel. Purgative. Not what you need. Quinine. That's for malaria. Probably not relevant. Whiskey. Always relevant. He selects a brown bottle labelled fever tonic, squints at it suspiciously, and pours a dose into a tin cup. Drink this. It's supposed to help. You drink it, because what choice do you have? And it tastes like someone dissolved tree bark in alcohol and added sugar to make it marginally less horrible. The ingredients, if you could read the faded label, probably include things like sassafras, chamomile, willow bark, and proprietary blend of mysterious substances that may or may not be toxic. Whether it will actually help with your fever is anyone's guess, but at least you're doing something, which feels better than doing nothing, even if the medical efficacy is questionable at best. Historians still argue whether the minimal medical care available aboard 19th century vessels was due to economic constraints, lack of medical knowledge, or simple acceptance that sailors were expendable labour. But from your current position as someone who might die from what could be a simple cold with proper treatment, the academic debate seems less important than the immediate reality that you're on your own with this illness. The quirky detail that reveals just how primitive maritime medicine was. Many ships' medicine chests included surgical instruments for amputations, saws, knives, needles, under the assumption that captains might need to perform emergency surgery if a sailor was seriously injured. Most captains had absolutely no surgical training beyond maybe watching someone else perform an amputation once, and the procedure typically involved getting the patient drunk on whiskey, holding them down, sawing off the damaged limb as quickly as possible, and cauterizing the wound with hot tar. Survival rates for shipboard amputations were spectacularly low, but the alternative, leaving a crushed or infected limb untreated, was guaranteed death, so captains occasionally attempted it anyway. Fortunately, your current fever doesn't require amputation, which is honestly the best you can hope for in terms of maritime medical care. You spend the next 36 hours in your bunk, drifting in and out of feverish sleep while the Northern Star continues toward Chicago. Chen brings you weak broth, essentially hot water with salt pork flavour, which is supposedly therapeutic but mainly just gives you something to consume besides water. The fever peaks on the second day, leaving you soaked in sweat and barely conscious, and you have a moment of genuine fear that you might actually die from what could be influenza or pneumonia, or just severe exhaustion manifesting as illness. The forecastle is not an ideal recovery room. It's damp, poorly ventilated, and full of sailors coming and going for their watch rotations, but it's what you have. By the third day, the fever breaks, leaving you weak and hollow, but definitely alive. Captain Morrison checks on you with obvious relief, not because he's particularly concerned about your welfare, but because losing a crew member to illness mid-season creates logistical problems. "You'll live," he announces with the confidence of someone who's made this diagnosis before, without any medical basis. "Light duties for 2 days, then back to full work. We can't afford slackers." And just like that, your medical emergency's over, resolved not through effective treatment, but through your body's own immune system managing to fight off whatever invaded it. The fever tonic probably did nothing. The broth was mainly psychological comfort, and you survived despite the available medical care rather than because of it. Welcome to maritime medicine, where the treatment plan is don't get sick. But if you do, hope you're strong enough to recover on your own. You're recovering from your fever, standing watch on a calm July afternoon, when you make the catastrophic mistake of whistling a cheerful tune while coiling rope. The Norwegian sailor is beside you instantly, his hand clamping over your mouth with surprising force for someone who's usually so mild-mannered. "Never whistle on a ship," he hisses with genuine urgency. "You'll whistle up a wind." You try to point out that wind is actually desirable on a sailing vessel, kind of the whole point of the operation, but he's not having it. Not that kind of wind, a storm wind, a killing wind. You whistle, and the lakes will answer, and we'll all drown because you couldn't keep your mouth shut. His expression makes clear this isn't friendly advice. It's a survival directive from someone who's watched too many sailors die to tolerate what he considers dangerous behaviour. Welcome to the world of maritime superstitions, where rational men who can navigate by stars and calculate cargo loads also believe that whistling, renaming vessels, or sailing on Fridays will anger supernatural forces that control your fate. You might think this is primitive nonsense, the kind of magical thinking that belongs in the past along with bloodletting and miasma theory. But you'd be wrong. These superstitions are taken deadly seriously by Great Lakes sailors, passed down through generations, enforced through peer pressure and genuine fear, and maintained because, here's the unsettling part, enough sailors have witnessed coincidences that seem to validate the beliefs that nobody wants to be the one who tests them and proves they're real. The mainstream historical fact that explains why superstitions persist, Maritime work is inherently dangerous and often beyond human control, which creates psychological need for explanatory frameworks that give sailors some sense of agency over their fates. If you believe disasters happen because someone whistled or because the ship was renamed, then you can prevent disasters by controlling those behaviors. It's more comforting than accepting that random chance and natural forces will kill you regardless of your precautions. Superstitions provide the illusion of control in an environment where actual control is minimal, and humans will cling to any belief that makes the universe seem less arbitrary and hostile. The prohibition against whistling is just the beginning of your education in sailor superstitions. Over the following weeks, you learn that Fridays are unlucky sailing days. The Northern Star will delay departure rather than cast off on a Friday, even if it means losing a day of profitable sailing. The reasoning traces back to Christian tradition. Jesus was crucified on a Friday. But it's evolved into a generalized belief that Friday departures invite disaster. Captain Morrison, who's otherwise a practical man focused on profit margins, absolutely refuses to sail on Fridays, and he's not alone. Most Great Lakes captains share this superstition, which means the entire shipping industry operates around a belief that one day per week is cursed. Renaming vessels is considered even more dangerous than whistling. It's believed to anger the spirits or gods or whatever supernatural forces sailors believe are keeping score of human hubris. The Northern Star has carried her name since being launched 20 years ago, and she'll carry it until she's broken up for scrap or sinks to the bottom of the lakes. If she were ever renamed, maybe sold to new owners who wanted to rebrand her, the superstition holds that she'd be cursed to disaster. Historians still argue whether the statistical evidence supports any correlation between renamed vessels and increased accident rates, but sailors aren't interested in statistical analysis. They're interested in not dying, and if avoiding name changes helps, then names stay fixed. The quirky detail that reveals how deep these superstitions run. Many Great Lakes sailors believe that drowning victims should never be recovered if at all possible, because retrieving bodies angered the lakes and would result in additional deaths as the waters demanded replacement souls. This created horrible situations where sailors watched their shipmates drown, but refused to attempt recovery even when it might have been feasible, all because they believed retrieval would curse the vessel. The superstition was strong enough that families of drowned sailors sometimes couldn't recover bodies for proper burial, leaving them without closure and feeding the belief that the lakes themselves were sentient predators that demanded tribute. You learn that women aboard vessels are considered bad luck, not women in general, but women as passengers or crew on working ships. The Northern Star has never carried female passengers, and Captain Morrison makes clear he never will. Women upset the balance, he explains with the confidence of someone stating obvious fact rather than baseless prejudice. Ships are jealous, see? They're female, we call them she, and they don't tolerate other women aboard. Causes storms, mechanical failures, bad luck across the board. You wisely don't point out that this makes no logical sense, because logic isn't the framework these beliefs operate in, and arguing with superstitions is how you become the outsider nobody trusts. Other prohibitions include never sail with anyone named Jonah, biblical reference to the prophet who brought storms, avoid sailing vessels with black exteriors, associated with death and mourning, don't bring bananas aboard, they supposedly cause mysterious disasters. Yes, seriously, sailors were afraid of fruit. And never say the word drown aloud while aboard. Speaking the word invites the reality. The list goes on, dozens of superstitions that range from semi-plausible to completely arbitrary, all maintained through social pressure and selective memory that emphasizes the times when breaking the superstition seemed to correlate with disaster. The Norwegian also teaches you the protective rituals that supposedly ward off bad luck. You're supposed to touch the mast for luck before dangerous work. You should pour a small amount of your first drink overboard as an offering to the lakes, literal libation to appease water spirits. If you see St. Elmo's fire, that electrical phenomenon where glowing plasma appears on masts during storms, you're supposed to consider it a good omen from the saints rather than simple atmospheric physics. And if you dream of drowning, you're supposed to tell someone immediately, because sharing the dream supposedly prevents it from becoming prophetic. It's a complex system of do's and don'ts that serves more as social bonding mechanism than actual protection, but good luck explaining that to sailors who've staked their lives on these beliefs. The most unnerving part of these superstitions is watching otherwise rational men genuinely believe in them. First, Mate Johansen is an experienced sailor who can calculate tides, read weather patterns, and manage complex cargo logistics, but he also refuses to sail without his lucky coin, a Spanish dollar from the 1840s that he keeps in his pocket at all times. Captain Morrison navigates by scientific instruments, but also keeps a horseshoe nailed above his cabin door. The contradiction between practical competence and magical thinking would be amusing if it weren't so sincere. You're learning to follow the superstitions not because you believe them, but because violating them makes you a social pariah and potentially gets you blamed if something does go wrong. If you whistle and a storm arrives 3 days later, some sailors will absolutely connect those events and hold you responsible. It's easier to just comply with the traditions, avoid the taboo behaviors, and maintain social harmony among men you're depending on for survival. Whether the superstitions have any supernatural validity matters less than their social function, as shared beliefs that bind the crew together and provide explanatory frameworks for random tragedy. You stop whistling aboard ship, and you sleep a little easier knowing you haven't angered whatever forces might be listening. The calendar shows late October, and you're starting to notice changes that signal the approaching end of the season. The air carries a sharper bite each morning, your breath visible as you emerge on deck for the dawn watch. The water temperature has dropped enough that spray stings when it hits your face. And most tellingly, Captain Morrison is making increasingly conservative decisions about which runs to accept, which routes to take, and how long to stay in port before casting off. He's watching the weather with the attention of someone who knows that November on the Great Lakes is when the water transforms from merely dangerous to actively homicidal, and no cargo is valuable enough to justify sailing into the gales that define the fall storm season. By mid-November, the decision is made for you. Ice begins forming in the harbours, not solid sheets yet, but scattered plates that clink against the hull and signal that your working season is over. The Northern Star makes her final run of the year from Chicago to Buffalo, delivers her last cargo of grain, and then Captain Morrison announces what everyone already knew. We're laying up for winter. Get her ready for storage. This simple statement represents a dramatic shift in your circumstances. You're about to go from overworked and underpaid sailor to unemployed and desperate landsman, with months of cold weather ahead and minimal savings to survive on. Laying up a vessel for winter is a complex process that's basically the opposite of all the preparation that went into starting the season. The cargo hold needs to be completely emptied and cleaned, every scrap of grain, every splinter of lumber, every trace of iron or dust swept out to prevent rot and infestation during the idle months. You spend 2 days down in that hold with brooms and shovels, removing material that's accumulated in corners and crevices, knowing that anything left behind will create problems when the Northern Star returns to service next April. The work is cold, tedious, and depressing, because every shovelful of grain dust is a reminder that this income stream is ending. The sails come down next, a major operation that requires the entire crew working in coordination. Each sail is carefully furled, inspected for damage that needs repair before next season, and then lowered and stored either in the vessel's hold or in a warehouse on shore. The canvas needs to stay dry during winter or it will rot, which means proper storage is critical. You're hauling heavy bundles of canvas across the deck, lowering them through hatches, and arranging them in the hold with the care of someone handling valuable equipment, which they are because replacing a sail costs money that Captain Morrison would rather not spend. The mainstream historical fact that defines winter economics, the Great Lakes shipping season in the 1870s, typically ran from April through November, meaning vessels sat idle for 4 to 5 months each year. Ship owners had to maintain their vessels without earning revenue during this period, while sailors faced extended unemployment with no income. This seasonal pattern created boom and bust cycles, where sailors earned wages for 7 or 8 months, and then survived, or didn't, on their savings during the winter layoff. The rigging gets stripped down to basics. Running rigging is removed, coiled and stored. Standing rigging is loosened to reduce stress on the masts. Blocks and tackles are removed and oiled to prevent rust. Anything that can be damaged by winter weather or stolen by opportunistic thieves gets taken off the vessel and locked in storage. The anchors are secured, the wheel is lashed in place, and protective tarps are stretched over exposed areas of the deck. By the time you're finished, the Northern Star looks stripped and vulnerable, a shadow of the working vessel she was just weeks ago. Finally comes the financial reckoning you've been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Captain Morrison sits in his cabin with his ledger, calling crew members in one at a time to settle their accounts for the season. When your turn comes, he runs through the numbers with practiced efficiency. 7 months at $25 per month, that's $175 gross, minus 14 for board, minus 14 for bunks, minus equipment charges totaling $8, minus $2. For that week you were sick and couldn't work full duties, minus $3 for damage to ship's property, that rope you improperly coiled that had to be replaced. The deductions pile up faster than you can track them, and when he finishes calculating, your final settlement is $121 for 7 months of dangerous labour. It's more money than you've ever held at once, and simultaneously far less than you thought you'd earned. Historians still argue whether the seasonal unemployment of Great Lakes sailors represented a reasonable trade-off for relatively high wages during the working season, or whether it created cycles of poverty that trapped workers in perpetual financial instability. But from your current position as someone holding $121 that needs to last 4 or 5 months, the debate seems less important than the immediate problem of survival, the quirky detail that makes winter unemployment even more challenging. Many sailors couldn't find alternative work during the winter because they lacked skills applicable to shore-based employment, and their reputations as lake men sometimes worked against them. Landlocked employers viewed sailors as transient, unreliable, and prone to drinking. This created situations where experienced sailors with valuable maritime skills ended up doing menial labour for minimal wages during the winter, or simply living on credit and showing up broke at the docks each spring, desperate to sign on to any vessel that would have them. You walk off the Northern Star in late November with your single bag of possessions, your $121 in wages, and the certain knowledge that you'll be back next April because you don't have better options. The boarding houses near the docks are already filling with laid-off sailors, all of them trying to stretch their settlements across 4 months of expenses in a city that doesn't get cheaper just because you're unemployed. Rent, food, coal for heat, and the occasional necessity will consume your wages at maybe $30 to $40 per month if you're careful, which means you'll arrive at spring either broke or close to it. The Northern Star sits at her dock, ice forming around her hull, masts bare against the grey November sky. She'll hibernate here until April, when First Mate Johansson will start recruiting crew for the new season. You'll probably be one of the first to show up because the alternatives are worse, and at least aboard that vessel you know what you're getting. Dangerous work, poor pay, terrible conditions, and the slim possibility of surviving long enough to do it all again next year. Winter stretches ahead like a prison sentence, and the only thing that will end it is the spring thaw and your desperate need for employment. You're sitting in a boarding house room in Buffalo in February, your savings dwindling faster than you'd hoped, and you're facing the question that every Great Lakes sailor confronts during the long winter months. Do you go back? Spring is maybe 6 weeks away, which means the shipping agents will soon be working the docks again, recruiting crews for vessels emerging from winter storage. The Northern Star will need sailors. Vessels always need sailors because the turnover rate is spectacular, and you could walk down to the waterfront tomorrow and probably secure a berth for the coming season. But should you? That's the question keeping you awake at night, and the answer isn't as obvious as you thought it would be back in November, when you walked off that ship swearing you'd never return. The arguments against going back are compelling and numerous. You spent 7 months doing dangerous work in miserable conditions for wages that barely covered your expenses. You watched a man get injured by a snapped rope. You nearly died from a fever that received essentially no medical treatment. You lived in a damp forecastle with rats and 8 other men, ate salt pork until you dreamed about vegetables, and worked in a watch system designed to ensure you never slept properly again. Your hands still bear scars from rope burns and rust cuts. Your lungs still carry the memory of iron or dust. Your body still remembers what it felt like to pump bilge water for hours while a storm tried to sink the vessel around you. Why would anyone voluntarily return to that existence? And yet, the alternatives aren't inspiring. You've spent the winter working odd jobs, shoveling snow, loading wagons, doing manual labour that pays maybe $2 a week when you can find it. Factory work is available, but it pays barely, more than sailing, and comes with its own dangers. Machinery that can crush you, chemical exposures that slowly poison you, 12-hour shifts in buildings with no windows and air thick with cotton dust or coal smoke. The farms aren't hiring in winter, and even when spring comes, farm labour means 14-hour days for minimal wages and the joy of living in your employer's barn. Shore work is safer than sailing, probably, but it's also grinding, endless, and offers almost no prospect of advancement or escape from poverty. The mainstream historical fact that explains why sailors kept returning: Great Lakes maritime work in the 1870s was genuinely terrible, but it was terrible in ways that felt different from the terrible options available on land. Sailors earned slightly more money, experienced something that could generously be called adventure, developed specialized skills that gave them identity and status among their peers, and maintained hope, however unrealistic, that they might eventually advance to officer positions or save enough to invest in vessel ownership themselves. The alternatives offered similar misery with less romantic narrative framing. You've also discovered during this winter that being a sailor carries a certain identity that's hard to give up. When you mention your work on the lakes, people react with interest, sometimes respect, occasionally envy. There's a mystique to maritime work that doesn't attach to factory employment or farm labour. You've acquired skills, rope work, cargo handling, basic navigation, that mark you as someone who's done something beyond ordinary. The Norwegian's words echo in your memory. Once you've sailed, shore life feels small. You're starting to understand what he meant. The boarding house room feels confining after months on open water. The city streets feel claustrophobic after horizons that stretched for miles. The daily routine of landlocked employment feels suffocating after the variety of maritime work. There's also the uncomfortable reality that you're not qualified for much else. 7 months aboard the Northern Star have given you maritime skills, but haven't prepared you for careers that require formal education or specific technical training. You can hand, reef and steer, but you can't do bookkeeping, operate telegraph equipment, or practice law. Your economic options are constrained by your lack of credentials, and sailing is one of the few fields where you can earn something approaching a living wage despite having no formal qualifications beyond physical strength and willingness to endure hardship. Historians still argue whether the Great Lakes shipping industry exploited desperate workers or provided genuine economic opportunity for men with limited alternatives. But from your current position as someone trying to decide between returning to known misery versus accepting unknown alternatives, the academic debate seems less important than the practical reality that you need. Income and sailing provides it. The quirky detail that reveals how this decision played out across thousands of sailors. Great Lakes shipping companies in the 1870s experienced crew turnover rates of approximately 50% per year, meaning that half of each season's sailors didn't return the following spring. Some found better opportunities, some died, some were permanently injured, and some simply decided the trade wasn't worth the cost. But the other half kept coming back, season after season, either because they genuinely preferred maritime work or because they couldn't envision alternatives that seemed better. You're about to discover which half you belong to. You're also contemplating the possibility of advancement. You're no longer a completely green sailor. You've survived a season, learned the basics, proven you can do the work. Next season, you might be classified as an able-bodied seaman, which means better pay, better treatment, and better sleeping arrangements. In a few years, if you survive and learn enough, you could potentially become a mate, then eventually a captain. It's a long shot. Most sailors never advance beyond able-bodied status, but it's possible, and possibility is sometimes enough to justify returning to hardship. The spring thaw is coming. The ice is breaking up in the harbours. The shipping agents will start recruiting soon, and you're walking toward the waterfront, your single bag over your shoulder, ready to sign on to the Northern Star or whatever vessel will have you, because the truth is that you're a sailor now, for better or worse, and sailors return to the water the way migratory birds return to the same nesting grounds year after year, not because it's safe or comfortable, but because it's what they know how to do. The Northern Star will sail again in April. Her hull will creak through another season of storms and cargo runs. Her deck will feel familiar beneath your feet, even as you wonder how many more seasons you'll walk it. Captain Morrison will criticise your rope work. Chen will serve salt pork. The watchers will grind away your sleep. And somewhere in the rhythm of waves against the hull, in the sound of wind filling canvas, in the particular loneliness of isolation on open water, you'll find something that keeps you coming back despite all the rational arguments against it. Maybe you'll make mate someday. Maybe you'll drown in a November gale. Maybe you'll walk away next winter with enough savings to start something different, something safer, something that lets you sleep through entire nights in a bed that doesn't move. But for now, in this moment, you're a Great Lakes sailor, and that's enough. The water cools, the season approaches, and you'll answer because that's what sailors do. The lakes don't promise safety or comfort or fair compensation. They promise work and weather and the slim chance of surviving long enough to see another spring. And somehow, improbably, that's enough to bring you back. Close your eyes now. Let the rhythm of imagined waves carry you towards sleep. The Northern Star is at rest in her winter berth, ice melting around her hull, waiting for the season to begin again. You're warm, you're dry, you're safe on solid ground. Tomorrow's decisions can wait. Tonight, just drift.